He assumed the quiet seamstress couldn't read. She was revising his ledgers by candlelight. Edwin Holt said it on a Wednesday. The kind of unremarkable Wednesday that vanishes from memory before the week is out. He was near the front counter of his merchant house talking to a cotton trader named Burton, and the subject of Cora had come up because Burton had an eye for tailoring and had paused near the door to examine a jacket on the display hook. The jacket was one of Cora's recent alterations, taken in at the back and reshaped at the collar, and it showed in the way that genuine skill shows, quietly and without announcement, in the flatness of the seams and the precision of the break at the wrist. Burton ran his thumb along the collar and asked who had done the work. Holt glanced toward the back workroom, where Cora sat with her needle moving in its small, even strokes, and said, without pausing to consider whether to lower his voice, "Skilled with her hands, I will give her that. But not the thinking kind. Can't even write her own name, I would wager." Burton made a sound of polite acknowledgement and moved on to cotton prices. Cora did not lift her head. She did not change the pace of her needle. She did not allow anything in her face or her posture or her breathing to indicate that she had heard a word of the exchange, because she had been practicing this specific skill for a long time, and she was very good at it. The practice was this. You received words like those the way a stone receives rain. You let them fall. You did not absorb them, and did not react to them, and gave the speaker nothing in return, not a flinch, not a tightening along the jaw, not the barely visible flicker of expression that rises to a person's face when something registers and they are managing not to show it. You gave them stillness, and in that stillness, they heard the confirmation of what they had already decided. She had learned this from her mother. Ruth had not taught it as a named thing. She had demonstrated it across the whole course of her life, and Cora had understood watching her that it was a form of armor, as real as any physical protection, and considerably more useful in the situations that arose most often. But she filed the words. She filed everything. 2 years and 4 months she had worked in Holt's shop. In those 2 years and 4 months she had built an inventory inside her head that would have shocked everyone in the building if they had known it existed. Not just the things Holt said about her. The numbers. The transactions. The figures that came out of his mouth while he dictated letters she was supposedly too simple to understand. The pricing he discussed while she basted seams 3 feet from his open office door. The supplier terms his clerk George Ames worked through aloud while trying to reconcile accounts she was supposedly too ignorant to follow. She had followed all of it. She had been following it for 2 years and 4 months, and now she was beginning to understand where the following had been leading. That evening she walked the 40 minutes home from the shop with her shawl pulled close against the October cold, and her mind running in the loose and quick way it always ran on the walk home, letting the day's gathered details arrange themselves in order. A freight charge mentioned that morning in Holt's conversation with the delivery man. A delivery slip she had glimpsed on the edge of the cutting table, face up for perhaps 3 seconds before someone shifted it. A figure that George had muttered to himself and then corrected, swapping one number for a slightly smaller one. Not the deliberate gesture of someone constructing a discrepancy, but the automatic gesture of someone catching an arithmetic error. She had heard the original number, and she had heard the corrected one, and she had kept both. These things slotted into columns in her mind, the way cut fabric pieces slot into their shapes before sewing. Each piece was small on its own. The pattern they made together was not small at all. Augusta, in October of 1887, had the compressed and layered quality of Southern American cities of that era. The river, always present in the smell of the air, even when you were streets away from it. The rail yard audible across the rooftops in the early evening, when the wind came from the east. The specific mix of commerce and movement and quiet labor that constituted the city's ordinary life. Cora had learned Augusta block by block over enough years that the route from Holt's merchant house on Broad Street to the boarding house on Telfair required no conscious thought to navigate. Her feet knew it. The rest of her was occupied with what she was carrying. The figure she was working on, $9.40 per bolt of Baltimore wool, the charge mentioned that morning. Against that figure, the one she had recorded from a delivery slip seen upside down on the cutting table 3 weeks earlier, $7.15 per bolt, the same supplier's standard freight rate for the same route. The difference was $2.25 per bolt. She had logged 14 separate deliveries of Baltimore wool in the past 6 months. She ran the multiplication in her head, and then held the result, knowing she would write it down and check it before she trusted it. She did not trust arithmetic that had never appeared on paper. And alongside that calculation, the figure that had been sitting in a column of its own since August, $340. The freight credit from the Memphis supplier, Whitmore and Sons. Holt had described its resolution to George in August, clearly and with satisfaction. A shipping dispute settled in his favor. Money coming back to him. Cora had been 3 feet from the open office doorway when he said it. She had heard every word. She had waited for the credit to surface in any subsequent conversation or visible document. It had not appeared anywhere. It had simply stopped existing, with the quiet confidence of a vanishing that no one was expected to notice. The boarding house on Telfair Street was a 2-story wooden building kept by a woman named Nora Dean, who had been a laundress since before the war and intended to remain one until the day she stopped waking up. The house was not grand. The walls were thin enough that rain on the roof sounded like rain on your hat. The 4th stair groaned without fail. In January, the upstairs hallway kept the cold the way stone keeps cold, deeply and without intending to release it. But Nora charged fair rent and asked few questions and kept the common areas clean, and had never in 2 years said a single thing to Cora that was not either practical or kind. Those qualities were worth more to Cora than comfort. She needed quiet. She needed a door she could close. She needed a space where she could work without explanation. Nora was at the stove when Cora came through. She said without looking up that there was bread on the board. Cora took a piece and carried it upstairs and set it on the edge of the table and largely forgot it until it was cold. She sat down before she took off her coat. The composition book was on the left side of the pine table, with the pencil in the fold of the spine. She opened it to the last page she had written and read through it, her lips moving very slightly, in the habit she had never broken from the earliest days of learning to read, when the soft movement of saying the words helped her hold their meaning as her eyes moved forward. She did not mind the habit. She had made peace with the things she carried from those years. Her mother Ruth had taught her the letters from a Bible that was missing its first 30 pages and its last 12. It was, Ruth had said without sadness, what they had, and they used what they had. The lessons had happened in stolen fragments of time, in the gaps between demanded tasks, conducted in a silence so complete and so habitual that the smell of candle wax had become, for Cora, permanently linked to the feeling of holding her breath. The Quaker woman who had first shown Ruth the letters, a spare and resolute person named Clara Forsyth, who had come into the community with the specific quiet purpose of making herself useful, had understood that the teaching had to be invisible to survive, and she had taught it invisibly, and Ruth had learned it that way, and had passed it to Cora in the same invisible manner. Ruth was not a fluent reader. She had never had the time or opportunity to become one. She read the way a person crosses uncertain terrain, testing each step before committing to the next, but she could cross it. She knew the letters and the sounds they made, and the way sounds assembled into words, and words assembled into meaning, and she had transferred all of this to Cora with the intensity of a woman who understood clearly that what was being passed between them was not merely an education. It was a specific and irreplaceable form of armor. A person who can read, Ruth used to say, cannot be as easily cheated. She said it the way she said practical things, the way she described testing fabric for quality before agreeing on a price, the way she described checking a hem before trusting it to hold. It was information about surviving in a world with specific dangers, and the specific danger was this: men with ledgers, men with receipts, men with agreements written on paper that they handed you and called fair, and if you could not read what was on the paper, you had only their word for what it said. Their word was not always worth the breath that carried it. Cora had taken the lesson exactly as it was given, and she had not stopped there. Later, a teacher at the Freedmen's School, named Mr. Porter, had given her the other half of what she needed. A thin man from Ohio, who had arrived after the war, with a box of primers, and a conviction that numeracy was as necessary as literacy, that a person who could read words but not figures was still vulnerable in a specific and costly way. He was right, and he was also someone who genuinely liked teaching, which made him rare. He had given her, beyond the practical skill, the particular satisfaction of a balanced column, the way every figure on one side had its precise answer on the other, the way the thing simply was what it was without accommodation and without preference, the quiet certainty of arithmetic, which has no opinion and no interest in how anyone feels about the result. She had loved it from the first lesson. She had never stopped. By the time Edwin Holt hired her, she had been keeping her literacy and her numeracy invisible for 17 years. Not from shame. From the clear-eyed understanding that certain knowledge, located in certain people, produced dangerous reactions in others, and she had observed enough of those reactions from a careful distance to know what they looked like. A black woman in Georgia who could read made some white men nervous in ways that expressed themselves poorly. A black woman who could also keep accounts accurately made those same men something considerably worse than nervous. And men with power who felt that way were not a condition she intended to create around herself when she had any choice in the matter. So she kept the coal inside, small and steady, fed it without showing the flame. The accounting primer under her mattress was the third she had worked through from the AME Reading Room's lending collection. A woman named Mrs. Calloway managed the collection with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understood that every item in it was there because it mattered to someone, and she had never in 3 years made any comment about what Cora chose to take home. This restraint was a form of respect, and Cora held it in high regard. She wrote the evening's figures in their column. The Baltimore freight charge, $9.40 per bolt. The established standard rate, $7.15. The difference, $2.25. She counted the log deliveries, 14. She did the multiplication out in full, each step written, and then checked. $31.50. She marked it with her triangle for estimated figures, and placed it in its column beside the others. She turned back 2 pages, and reread the Memphis credit column. $340. The unrecovered freight credit, the space in the accounts where a resolution should have appeared and had not. She had now heard 3 separate conversations since August, in which Holt referred to the Whitmore and Sons account, and in none of them had he mentioned pursuing the outstanding credit, or received any indication that it had been received. A careful merchant who had simply forgotten would have been reminded by now. These conversations had not been about forgetting. She added the 2 running figures together and considered them alongside the ones that had come before. The candle shortened. Nora's footsteps moved below. The house settled. She kept writing until the pencil needed sharpening, sharpened it over the newspaper on the table, and kept writing. She wrote down everything she had gathered in the past 2 years and 4 months that touched these columns. Every overheard reference to supplier pricing, every glimpsed invoice, every number George had said aloud while catching up on entries. She was building a parallel account of Holt's business from nothing but attention and memory and time. Tomorrow was Tuesday. George Ames took his midday meal with a friend from the hardware store every Tuesday. He was gone 45 minutes, sometimes closer to an hour. Holt often used that time for client meetings in the front room. She held this fact in its place alongside the others and did not attach anything to it. Then she blew out the candle, lay down, and stared at the ceiling until the dark became something she could sleep inside. She thought about the ledger long after the candle went out. Not the figures themselves, which she had committed to paper and checked twice, but the fact of what the figures meant sitting in an official record in red ink in Holt's own hand. There was a difference between knowing something and seeing it written, and she had not fully understood the weight of that difference until now. For 2 years, she had been building an estimation, a reconstruction, a parallel account assembled from fragments. What she had seen on the table beside Holt's desk was not a reconstruction. It was the record itself, the original, the thing from which all reconstructions worked and toward which all investigations would eventually return. And the record itself said the same thing her reconstruction had said, in the same language and with the same numbers. She had been right. Not approximately right, not directionally right. Right in the specific and verifiable way that made being right mean something. She also thought, lying in the dark on the narrow bed with the composition book on the table 6 feet away, about the 9 minutes she had stood at the table. She had been in Holt's office for 9 minutes. For 2 years and 4 months, she had worked in a building where every figure she encountered was a fragment, partial, glimpsed, overheard, read upside down or sideways, or in the brief second when a document faced her before it was moved. 9 minutes of direct and unobstructed access had given her more than 2 years of careful accumulation. She had verified in 9 minutes what she had spent months estimating. She had also learned something from those 9 minutes about the nature of what she was documenting. The ledger was a careful document, kept by a careful man. The figures in it were precise and organized, and correctly entered in the categories where they belonged. The missing freight credit was not a mistake in the entries. It was an absence, where an entry should have been. The differential billing was not an arithmetic error or a miscalculation. It was a choice, expressed in the numbers, that was consistent across accounts and clients and purchases and time. A careful man did not make consistent errors in the same direction across multiple accounts over multiple years. A careful man made deliberate choices and recorded them carefully. She filed this distinction in the composition book the following evening, in the section she was beginning to think of as the interpretive section, separate from the columns of figures, where she put the conclusions she was drawing from the figures and the reasoning behind those conclusions. The distinction between absence and error. The distinction between consistent directional pattern and random clerical mistake. These distinctions would matter if the figures ever needed to do something beyond sitting in her composition book in a room on Telfair Street. She did not yet know if they would. But she was keeping the record as though they might. The week after the Tuesday passed with the ordinary pace of weeks at the shop. George reconciled his October invoices. Holt took 2 client meetings in the front room and 1 at the bank. A new shipment of French lace arrived and Cora was asked to assess its quality before Holt decided on a price, which was one of the occasional tasks assigned to her that required her to touch the fabric and apply judgment about it. She assessed it honestly, as she always did, because the work was the work regardless of everything else, and she would not do the work badly. The lace was good quality. She said so. The back workroom of Holt's merchant house smelled that Tuesday morning of beeswax and fabric sizing, and the particular dry warmth of a small iron stove that had been burning since early morning. The 2 cutting tables ran parallel down the center of the space, their surfaces worn smooth in the areas where cutters worked, and darker at the corners that were rarely touched. Along the back wall, the shelves of bolt fabric stood in the arrangement Cora had suggested to Holt in her second week, and that he had adopted the following morning, without acknowledgement. Imported goods to the left in descending price. Domestic goods to the right by fiber type. Her work area was in the far left corner by the alley window. She had chosen it in her first week because the morning light fell at the right angle for close work, and because from her chair, angled precisely as she positioned it each morning, she had a clear and unobstructed view of the office doorway, 6 feet to her left, without appearing to be watching it. She had sat in this chair for 2 years and 4 months. She had seen a great deal from it. The morning assembled itself around her as it always did. Holt arrived at 8:05 and moved through the shop on his standard circuit of inspection, checking the front display and the window arrangement and the counter surface. He went to the office, emerged to tell George that the prior week's ledger entries needed cross-referencing with the October supplier invoices before filing, and went back. George had arrived at 8 and had spent the intervening minutes arranging and rearranging a stack of correspondence on his desk with the energy of someone who wanted to appear already busy when the proprietor arrived, and he received the instruction with the focused seriousness of a young man who understood that his position was always more provisional than it felt from inside it. George Ames was 22 and had been in the role of junior accounts clerk for 14 months. In those 14 months he had learned a great deal about the mechanics of Holt's business, most of it taught by Holt himself and filtered accordingly. He was not unintelligent. He was young and not yet experienced enough to understand the difference between figures that describe the full truth of a business and figures that describe the version of that truth a merchant wanted his junior clerk to see. He worked conscientiously from what he was given. He talked to himself while he worked, in the low and constant murmur of someone who finds that vocalizing numbers helps him hold them while transferring them from one column to another, and he did this without any awareness that the woman in the corner with the needle was listening to the figures with the disciplined attention of someone who had been doing so for more than a year. A woman came in at 10 to look at dress fabric. She was thorough about it, in the way of someone making a genuine decision and willing to take the time it required. She handled every bolt Holt showed her, feeling the weight and the drape, holding pieces up to the window light to check the weave density. She asked whether a particular dark green would hold its color after washing, whether the ivory silk had been treated, whether the blue wool was the same weight throughout or thicker at the selvages, as some imported wools were. These were not uninformed questions. Holt answered each of them with the patience of a man who understood that the sale was still in play, and who had enough experience to know that patience at this stage paid better than hurrying. She left at the end of an hour without purchasing anything, saying she would think about it. Holt watched her go from the office doorway and returned to his desk. At 12 past noon, George put on his hat, said something brief to Holt that Cora could not make out, and went out the front door. 2 minutes later, Holt appeared in the office doorway, already wearing his coat and hat, a folded letter in one hand. He said to Cora, to the air around Cora, that he was meeting Mr. Atkins at the Merchants Bank for the midday hour, and would return by 2. He said it the way you inform a piece of equipment you are stepping away, in case the equipment needs to know not to be alarmed when you return. The front door opened and closed. She finished the seam she was working on, 3 stitches past the end point to secure the thread, a clean knot, a snip. She set the dress aside. She laid the needle on the work table and listened to the building for a moment. Street sound outside, the creak of the sign above the door, the tick of the stove, nothing from inside. She stood and crossed the workroom in 6 steps. The office door was open, as it always was when Holt was out, and she was the only other person in the building. There was nothing in the office that she could understand well enough to be any concern, in his understanding of the situation. So the door stood open. On the table beside his desk, the main ledger lay open. He had been working in it before he left, and had left it the way you leave a book when you step away for a moment, expecting to return quickly. Pages spread to where you had been working. No thought given to who else might be in the building, with eyes that could read. She stood at the edge of the table and read it. Her eyes moved across the pages with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been building this skill for years, through lending room texts and borrowed primers, and the sustained practice of self-teaching applied to a real and specific purpose. The structure of the accounts was immediately familiar. She located the sections she needed within the first 20 seconds. The Whitmore & Sons account, purchase figures, payment records, the correspondence log noting the August shipping dispute and its pending resolution, all entered correctly. And then, in the space where the resolution credit should have appeared the following month, nothing. September had no credit entry for Whitmore. October had none. $340 had been described in August as coming back to this business, and the accounts showed no evidence that it ever had. She moved to the right-hand page. Client billing. The names she found there were names she recognized. She held each billing figure against the wholesale cost estimates she had been building in the composition book for months, estimating the markup with the ease of someone who had practiced this calculation many times in preparation. What she found was not what standard merchant practice would have produced. On an imported silk purchase billed to one client, the markup was above 40% at her best estimate of wholesale cost, and above 37% at the most generous interpretation of that estimate. On a French lace purchase for a second client, the markup sat between 34 and 38%, depending on how she read the wholesale data. On a Belgian wool purchase for a third client, between 32 and 35%. All 3 were female clients buying high-end imported fabric, the kind of purchase for which no published price guide existed that a private buyer could access. They were trusting the merchant to be fair, because they had no other mechanism for determining fairness. She found a comparable male client purchase in the column below, domestic wool, billed to a man named Carrington. The markup on that purchase was 17%. She looked at these figures for 2 or 3 seconds. She had been standing at the table for 9 minutes. She knew from the pattern of George's Tuesdays that she had more time than that, but the longer she stood here, the more she was depending on a timing that could break in the wrong direction without warning. She heard a sound from outside. She held still, and determined it was a cart on the street, moving past without stopping. She turned and crossed back to the workroom, and sat down in her chair, and picked up the piece from the top of the basket, and found her needle, and threaded it, and began to sew. Her hands were completely steady. Her heartbeat was not loud, but it was present in a way that was not usual for a Tuesday afternoon in the workroom. She sewed. The needle went in and came out, and went in again, at the same measured, unhurried pace she always maintained. Nothing about the movement of her hands, or the angle of her head, or the rhythm of her breathing, that would indicate to anyone observing that anything had changed in the past 9 minutes. George came back at 12 minutes before 1. He hung his hat and went into the office and came out and mentioned, to no one in particular, that Mr. Holt had left the main ledger open again. He said it with the mild exasperation of a young man who had been told to be careful with the books, and who periodically encountered the contrast between that instruction and his employer's own habits. Cora said nothing. Holt returned at 2:22, went directly to the office, and she heard the ledger close with a deliberate sound, and then the drawer of the desk, and then the settling of a man into his afternoon correspondence. She worked until 5. She said her good evenings and walked out into the October afternoon and covered the 40 minutes at a pace slightly faster than usual. Not running, nothing visible about the urgency, but moving with the specific internal pressure of someone who is carrying more temporary information than she trusts herself to hold without committing it to paper. She did not eat before she sat down. She opened the composition book to a fresh section and wrote without pause for 2 full hours. Every figure she had been able to read in the 9 minutes at the table. Every account name, every discrepancy she had clocked. She wrote it and read it back and checked every calculation and read it back once more. The candle burned past midnight. When she set the pencil down, what was on the pages in front of her was no longer a collection of fragments pointing toward a possibility. It was a documented pattern pointing toward a conclusion. The missing freight credit was not an estimate. She had seen its absence directly, in ink, in the actual record. $340. Gone. The differential billing was not an inference. She had read the figures. Women paying between 32 and 40% above what fair markup would have produced. A man paying 17%. The same merchant, the same shop, the same transaction fundamentally, and the women paying roughly double. She was not ready to call it by a legal name. She was a seamstress at a pine table, not a lawyer, and not an examiner. She chose her words carefully. But what she had seen was wrong. Deliberately, specifically, systematically wrong. She sat in the dark after the candle went out and thought about her mother, who had given her the ability to read. She thought about Edwin Holt, standing before an open ledger and arriving at no thought whatsoever about who else might be in the building, with eyes that could follow what he had written. She thought about what came next. She did not yet know. But the question was real now, and she could not go on putting it aside. By December, the composition book was filling at a rate that had required her to pace herself, to resist the temptation to write everything down in real time, and instead, to discipline herself to carry things in her head during the day and release them onto the page in the evenings, with the care of someone who understands that the paper record is the only record, and that a careless entry is worse than no entry at all. She had developed her shorthand organically, as needed, over the months of working. The square for confirmed figures, the triangle for estimated ones, the circle for figures she had seen directly in a document, but had not been able to read fully, a small X for figures she had overheard, but could not verify against any written source. This taxonomy had become second nature, and when she read back through the pages of the composition book, she could tell at a glance the quality and source of every figure, which was the kind of information an examiner needed to know, and which she was keeping for herself, in case it ever became necessary to explain the methodology to someone else. She had begun to think, in the careful and non-committing way she thought about things she was not yet ready to decide, about what it would take to make these figures legible to someone outside her own head. Not just to show them to someone, but to show them in a way that would produce understanding, rather than confusion. The columns she had developed for herself were efficient, but they assumed familiarity with the underlying situation. A stranger looking at the composition book without context would see organized figures without a clear narrative connecting them. She thought about what narrative would need to accompany the figures to make their significance plain. She thought about this the way she thought about the construction of a garment, how the finished piece was only as strong as the most careful reading you had done of the wearer's shape and the fabric's behavior before you cut anything. She was not yet cutting anything, but she was taking the measurements. The pattern she had confirmed was consistent not only across client accounts, but across time. She had now documented enough transactions over a long enough period to be able to say, with the qualification that her wholesale cost estimates carried a known range of imprecision, that the differential billing had been in place without interruption for at least 20 months. This was not the pattern of a merchant who had made an opportunistic choice once or twice and then returned to honest practice. It was the pattern of a merchant who had built the differential into his standard pricing for a specific category of client and maintained it as a matter of routine business practice. She thought about what it meant to run a business that way, the specific calculation that was required, not just once but continuously, the assessment of each client's vulnerability to the overcharge, which was determined essentially by their inability to know the fair price of what they were buying. The selection of the category, imported goods from suppliers whose pricing was not publicly available, where the gap between what a client was charged and what the merchant had paid was genuinely unverifiable by any ordinary means. The consistency of the maintenance, month after month, transaction after transaction, never varying in the direction of the differential, even if varying slightly in the magnitude of it. This was a careful one, which meant the figures she was documenting were not the product of neglect or oversight. They were the product of sustained and deliberate attention. She held this conclusion and did not rush past it. She had learned from Mr. Porter that the conclusions you arrived at quickly were often the ones that needed the most careful examination afterward. She sat with the conclusion for several evenings and examined it from different angles and tested it against the alternative interpretations she could construct for the same set of data. Each time she tested it, the alternative interpretations were less consistent with the full body of what she had documented than the conclusion she had reached. The figures were saying something. They were saying it clearly, and without ambiguity. She was listening. She returned to that 9 minutes in her mind many times over the days that followed, not obsessively, with the specific, purposeful quality of a person reviewing a technical process to understand where its limits were and what those limits meant for everything that came after. She had been in the office for 9 minutes. She had covered the Whitmore account, the client billing accounts, and one male client comparison. She had not covered the supplier accounts in any detail. She had not covered the correspondence files. She had not looked at the balance sheets or the cash accounts. There was a great deal she had not seen. This was important to be honest about, because what she had seen was already compelling, and the temptation was to treat it as the full picture when it was not the full picture. It was a verified and significant portion of the picture. The portion she had not seen was accessible in principle, if the conditions of another such day arose. She was not going to force those conditions. She was not going to take risks she had not already calculated. But she would note what she had not yet seen, and she would be ready for opportunities that presented themselves naturally. The composition book had developed, by this point in November, into something she recognized as more than a personal record. It had the structure of a document. It had categories, methodology, a clear distinction between confirmed and estimated figures, running totals with their sources noted. She had not planned to build a document. She had planned to build her own understanding of what was happening in the building around her. But the two things had turned out, over the months of careful work, to be the same thing. The weeks that followed were the most demanding of her working life, and, in a way she had not anticipated, among the most absorbing. She had known demanding weeks before, weeks of grief, and weeks of scarcity, and weeks of loneliness, dense enough to constitute a kind of weather in itself, steady and impersonal, and requiring navigation, but not expected to change. These weeks were a different quality. They had the character that she associated with the earliest days of learning to read, when the letters had stopped being shapes on paper and started being sounds, and sounds had started being words, and a new dimension of the world had opened that had been invisible before. There was a particular focus that came from working on something genuinely important, where every observation might shift the picture, and every figure placed carefully could either hold or fall, depending on how solid the ground beneath it was. She had not felt that quality in a long time. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was alive in a way that comfort was not. She developed the method in the first week and refined it over the weeks that followed, not as something she had planned in advance, but as something that emerged from the specific demands of what she was doing, the way a workable sewing technique emerges from the particular properties of the fabric you are working with and what you need it to do. Mondays she gave to the Memphis account. The Whitmore & Sons freight credit question was her firmest anchor because it rested on a defined figure, a defined resolution described in Holt's own words to his own clerk, and a defined absence in the records that she had now confirmed directly. On Mondays she listened for anything that touched the Whitmore relationship, any conversation about the account, any mention of the supplier in any context, any document bearing the name that crossed her sightline. She had now heard 3 separate references to Whitmore in the weeks since August, and none of them had included any mention of the outstanding credit, or any visible action toward recovering it. A careful merchant who was simply unaware of an uncollected credit of $340 would, upon receiving any communication from that supplier, be reminded of it, and would take action. Holt had received 2 pieces of correspondence from Whitmore in the period she had been tracking, identifiable by the postmark she had been able to read when the letters arrived. and neither piece had produced any discussion of the credit or any visible follow-up. This was not the behavior of a man who had forgotten. This was the behavior of a man who knew. Tuesdays through Thursdays, she devoted to the client billing pattern. Her direct ledger reading had confirmed the differential for 3 accounts. What she needed now was to extend that confirmation across a larger sample, to establish that the 3 accounts she had seen were not anomalous, but representative of something consistent. She did this through the tools she had developed over 2 years, listening to every client pricing discussion that took place within her hearing, observing what fabric entered the shop and what prices were quoted for it, comparing those prices to the wholesale cost estimates she could make reliably, based on her knowledge of the inventory and the supplier pricing she had accumulated. She could not do this for every transaction. She could do it for enough. George Ames continued to be an entirely unknowing contributor to her picture. He talked to himself while he worked with the low, steady murmur of someone who uses vocalization to hold figures in place during transfer between columns, and Cora had learned over 14 months to listen to this murmur with the same disciplined attention she brought to everything else in the building. On a Thursday in the 3rd week of November, he was reconciling a stack of domestic supplier invoices against his own ledger entries, and he worked through the figures in a way that gave Cora, seated in the workroom with the door between them ajar, a clear set of domestic fabric wholesale costs to match against her own estimates. The match was close. The implication was that her estimates for imported fabric pricing, derived from the same methodology, were probably equally close. She marked the relevant entries in her composition book with the square rather than the triangle. By the 3rd week of November, the composition book held more than 40 pages of organized notes, and the pattern they described had achieved a sharpness she could no longer soften with careful language. She had now documented 7 separate fabric purchases for which she had been able to establish both an approximate wholesale cost and an actual billing figure. 6 of the 7 purchases were for female clients buying imported fabric. The 7th was for a male client purchasing domestic wool. The markup on the domestic wool was 17%. The average markup across the 6 imported fabric purchases to female clients was 36%, more than double. She checked this comparison 4 times, organizing the underlying figures in 4 different ways to make certain the differential was real and not an artifact of how she had arranged the data. Each check produced the same result. Mrs. Aldine Pratt came into the shop on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. Cora was in the workroom and heard her at the front counter, her voice distinct with the precision that came from years of choosing words carefully. She was asking about Belgian wool, whether the current season's stock had come in yet, whether it was comparable in weight to the English wool she had purchased the previous spring. Holt said it was close, possibly a little heavier, and brought several bolts for her consideration. Mrs. Pratt handled them with care, feeling the weight between her fingers, holding one up near the window. She asked about the price. Holt named a figure. Cora held it against her estimate of the wholesale cost of Belgian wool at current season pricing. The markup was 41%. Mrs. Pratt asked whether that was in line with last season's pricing. Holt said that wool prices had shifted slightly this year, which was true, though not in the direction or the magnitude that would explain what Cora was calculating. Mrs. Pratt purchased 2 bolts. She said she would return for a third, if the first 2 worked as she hoped. She said this with the characteristic careful manner of a woman who has learned to commit to exactly as much as she is certain of, and not one step further. When she had gone, Cora held the new figures in her mind until the evening, and then transferred them to the composition book. She added them to the existing total for Mrs. Pratt's account. The running total she had now assembled for Mrs. Pratt, across 18 months of documented purchases, was $243 above what fair markup would have produced. She looked at that figure for a moment, and then turned to the overall total, across all 5 documented female accounts, for the 18-month period she had covered. $914. She wrote it at the bottom of the column, and sat back on the stool. $914, extracted from a small group of women, through the mechanism of a price set above its fair level, by a margin too small in any individual transaction to trigger alarm, and too consistent, across transactions and time, to be anything other than deliberate. Extracted from women who had done everything right, who had asked careful questions, who had made thoughtful choices, who had trusted a merchant they had no particular reason not to trust. The trust had been used against them, with the casual and persistent efficiency of someone who had decided it was a resource available to him. She turned to a fresh section of the composition book. She needed to extend the reconstruction backward. 18 months was the period she had confirmed with the strongest data. The pattern was consistent enough that it was almost certainly older than 18 months. She needed to know how far it went back, and she needed to do it using the same rigorous distinction between confirmed and estimated that she had applied throughout. She read the chapter on multi-year account reconstruction in the accounting manual again before she blew out the candle. In the morning, she would go back to the shop and the needle and the quiet work of watching a man who had decided she was not watching anything at all. She would keep going until she knew the full size of what she was holding. The books she borrowed from Dupree's library over the course of those weeks were not only accounting texts. One of them was a history of merchant regulation in American commercial law, a dense and occasionally tedious volume that was nonetheless useful because it told her what kinds of merchant behavior had historically been subject to formal action and on what evidentiary basis, and what the standard of documentation was that had produced successful outcomes in past regulatory proceedings. She read it with the specific attention of someone who is not interested in the general history, but who is looking for the specific details that will be relevant to a specific situation. The picture it gave her was useful. Formal complaints against merchants that had resulted in successful outcomes had, in almost every documented case, been grounded in direct documentary evidence rather than witness testimony. Witness testimony could be discredited, challenged, attributed to malice or misunderstanding or misrecollection. Documentary evidence, if the documents could be verified, was considerably harder to dismiss. A complaint grounded in a well-documented parallel account of a business's transactions, cross-referenced against verifiable wholesale pricing data, was not the same kind of thing as a complaint grounded in an aggrieved customer's recollection of what she had been told. She thought about this distinction carefully and applied it to what she had been building in the composition book. Most of what was in the composition book was the product of sustained and disciplined observation, rather than direct documentary evidence in the narrow legal sense. The figures she had overheard, the estimates she had derived from wholesale cost data, the patterns she had assembled from those estimates, these were strong, they were consistent, they were as accurate as her methodology could make them, but they were built from fragments. The 9 minutes at the ledger had given her something different. The figures she had seen directly in the record were in a different category from the figures she had assembled from outside the record. They were the record. She understood from the regulatory history text that a formal complaint, which contained both verified figures from direct documentary observation and an estimated pattern consistent with those figures, documented over an extended period using a clearly explained methodology, would be received differently from a complaint that was entirely dependent on estimates. The verified figures served as anchors. They demonstrated that the estimating methodology was producing accurate results. If the estimates could be shown to match the actuals at the points where actuals were available for comparison, an examiner with genuine rigor would have reason to take the estimated pattern seriously as evidence of what a full examination of the actual records would find. She wrote this reasoning down in the interpretive section of the composition book, carefully, in the form of an argument rather than a conclusion, because she wanted to be able to find the weaknesses in it before anyone else did. Dupree had been watching her work over these weeks, in the way a person watches someone do a thing they understand and find impressive, not intrusively, but with a genuine and quiet attention. He had been adding books to the stack at her right hand, occasionally, without comment, books she had not requested, but that she had found, when she looked at them, to be directly relevant to what she was working on. A small volume on the structure of regulatory complaints, a brief text on the evidentiary standards of administrative proceedings in Georgia commercial law, a collected set of case summaries from Board of Trade actions going back 15 years. He had been preparing for this conversation for longer than she had been prepared to have it. She thought about this one evening at the pine table, the composition book open, the candle burning at its midpoint. She thought about the specific quality of his preparation, not steering, not pushing, but quietly making available what she would need when she arrived at the point she was approaching. This required a particular kind of faith in another person's judgment, the faith that they would arrive at the right place on their own, and that the most useful thing you could do was make sure the right resources were within reach when they did. She had not encountered this quality often. She did not take it for granted. She blew out the candle and lay in the dark, and thought about what she was going to do. She was getting close to being ready to know. The cold deepened in December, and the workroom was warmer than the street, but not warm in any absolute sense, and she found that the cold changed the quality of the work slightly, made her hands stiffer in the mornings until the stove had been burning for an hour, made her move with slightly more deliberateness through the early part of the day. She did not mind this. There was something about the cold that made the heated interior of the building feel more separate from the street outside, more enclosed, and that quality of enclosure suited the work she was doing. The things she was tracking existed inside this building. The cold outside was simply the cold outside. She thought often during December about George, not with suspicion, because she did not believe George was dishonest, with the specific and practical attention she paid to every element of the building that was relevant to what she was doing. George was the person in the building who touched the accounts most directly after Holt himself. He processed invoices, made entries, cross-referenced figures, filed documents. He worked in close proximity to the information she was tracking, and his proximity made him potentially both a source of information, through his inadvertent murmuring and his visible handling of documents, and a potential complication, if he ever became aware of what she was doing. She had assessed this risk early and had concluded that the risk was manageable because George was not paying any attention to her. She was the seamstress. She was in the corner with the needle. Nothing about her presence suggested to him that she had any particular relationship to the figures he was working with, because nothing about her behavior in the building had ever suggested this to anyone, which was by design and by years of practice. George's lack of attention to her was the same condition she depended on with Holt. It was the condition that had made 2.5 years of systematic observation possible. She was invisible in the specific way that people who have been consistently underestimated become invisible, which was the most reliable form of invisibility available, because it was maintained not by any effort on her part, but by the assumptions of the people around her. She was deeply aware of the cost of this condition. It was not a comfortable thing to be invisible in that way. The comfort was in what the invisibility made possible, not in the invisibility itself. She had made her peace with this distinction long ago, because it was a distinction that was simply true, and that needed to be held clearly, rather than softened into something more bearable. By the end of December, the running total across the documented female accounts for the 18-month period had reached $914. She had checked it 3 times. She sat with it for several evenings before she turned to the fresh pages at the back of the composition book and began planning the extension of the reconstruction backward. She needed more time. She needed 3 more months of evenings, of careful work at the pine table, of going back through everything she had accumulated and applying the methodology to the earlier period. She had the patience for this. She had been building it for 2 years. On the last Friday of November, she reviewed the full body of what she had accumulated and did something she had been resisting doing for weeks. She read the composition book from the first page to the current one, sequentially, as though she were reading it for the first time. This was a different kind of reading from the nightly review of recent entries. It was the reading of someone trying to understand what the whole thing looked like, not just what the latest additions had added to it. What it looked like was a record of sustained, careful attention applied over a long period to a specific set of transactions, producing a picture that was consistent, detailed, and pointing clearly in one direction. She had not chosen the direction. The figures had chosen it. She had simply followed them where they led, with the discipline she had been developing since she was 7 years old, and her mother had told her to carry the words carefully, to not too fast, to be sure. She was sure. She was also aware, reading the composition book from beginning to end, that what she had built was something that existed entirely in her hands and nowhere else in the world, that the knowledge in it was inaccessible to anyone except her, and that this was a condition she was approaching the end of being willing to maintain indefinitely. The composition book had been private while the picture was forming. The picture was now fully enough formed that the privacy served no further purpose except her own safety, and her own safety was not the only consideration in play. She blew out the candle and sat in the dark for a long time, and when she finally lay down, she did not immediately sleep. The AME reading room on Broad Street was a room Cora had come to know, the way you come to know a place that has been genuinely useful to you over a long period of time, which was differently from the way you knew a place you merely frequented. She knew the particular angle of the light through the 2 windows on Sunday afternoons, and the way it traveled across the reading tables, as the winter progressed and the sun moved lower. She knew the sound of Mrs. Calloway's lending desk chair, a low note of wood against wood, when she sat down or rose. She knew the community of the room, the regulars, and the occasional visitors, and the rhythms of who came when, and for what purpose. There were the newspaper readers, who arrived early in the hour and arranged themselves around the table nearest the door, reading the week's papers from 3 different cities, and sometimes reading aloud when something merited sharing. There were the letter writers and readers, people who came with correspondence they needed help composing or interpreting, working with the volunteers who offered this service with a practical directness that did not make anything harder than it needed to be. There were students from the evening school who came with specific reference needs and who worked with concentrated urgency. And there were a handful of people like Cora herself, who came to read in the quiet, who had been coming long enough that the room had accommodated their presence, the way a well-worn chair accommodates the person who sits in it most. She had not paid careful attention to the other regular readers until the first Sunday in December, when she looked up briefly from the Chambers manual and found a man at the far end of the table looking at her. He was between 55 and 65, with gray coming in strongly at his temples and a physical composure that came from years of practicing deliberateness. His jacket was old but well maintained, the kind of care that comes from not wanting to replace things before they have given everything they can. His hands lay flat on the table in front of him, ink permanently embedded in the skin around the fingernails, in the way that does not wash out from someone who works regularly with a printing press. He had a newspaper in front of him, but he was not reading it. He was looking at her with the attentive and not impolite expression of someone who has noticed something and is working out whether it is what they think it is. She met his gaze briefly and returned to the manual. He looked away. He was there the following Sunday when she arrived, and she was aware after a few minutes that the same careful attention had turned in her direction. She did not acknowledge it. She kept reading. On the 3rd Sunday, she had been working through a section on accounts receivable management for some minutes, when he leaned forward from his end of the table, keeping his voice at the room's level. "May I ask," he said, "whether that is an accounting primer?" She looked at him for a moment before she answered. He held her gaze with the same composure he brought to everything. No impatience in it, no edge. Simply a man waiting for whatever answer she chose. "It is," she said. "The Chambers edition?" She turned the front cover briefly toward him. He nodded. More useful for practical purposes than the Whitfield. The Whitfield is organized for theory. The Chambers is organized for someone who needs to use what they learn. He paused. "I have not often seen people in this room working through it." "There are not many who do," she agreed. He introduced himself as Charles Dupree. She gave him her name. They shook hands across the corner of the table with the brief formality appropriate to the setting, and returned to their respective reading. But when the hour ended and Dupree was rising from his chair, he paused and said, without hurry, that if she was interested in additional accounting texts, beyond what the room's collection held, he maintained a small library at his printing press on Ellis Street, and she was welcome to make use of it. She considered this on the walk home and through the following week, not suspiciously, but with the habitual care she brought to new things, testing the weight of it before she committed. The following Saturday afternoon, she found the printing press on Ellis Street. The building was narrow, with the faded confidence of a place that had been doing what it did for long enough that it no longer felt any need to announce itself. Dupree met her at the door and led her to a back room off the press floor, where 4 shelves of books were organized, with a system immediately legible to her, not alphabetical, but by subject, and then by application. Theoretical texts on the upper shelves, practical application texts in the middle, reference material at eye level. He showed her the organization, and then moved back to give her space to look without being watched. This was exactly the right thing to do, and she noticed that he did it. She chose a comprehensive accounting manual she had not seen before, a volume on commercial law addressing merchant agreements and supplier contracts, and a small text on formal business correspondence formats. She thanked him and moved toward the door. He asked, with a directness that felt earned rather than presumptuous, whether she was working on something specific or pursuing a more general study. "Generally for now," she said. He nodded. He did not press. She returned twice over the following 3 weeks, exchanging books and selecting others. Their conversations lengthened with each visit. He told her about his work with the AME network and the freedmen's schools, and the decades of advocacy he had built around the conviction that economic literacy was among the most durable forms of practical independence a community could develop, because it operated in every transaction and exchange of daily life, and was harder to legislate away than political rights, because it lived inside a person rather than in a document. He said these things as settled matters, without argument or demonstration, the way someone speaks about things they have confirmed to themselves many times over a long period. She listened carefully. She said little in return about her own situation, but she was observing how he thought, the way he connected specific cases to general principles, and back to specific cases, without losing precision at either end. The way he held what was uncertain, separately from what was established, without blending them into a comfortable average. He was careful. He was honest. He was not performing either quality. On the fourth Saturday, a cold afternoon, with the press quiet and the stove in the back room doing what it could, he made tea, and they sat at the back table, and he asked her for the third time what she was working on. This time, she took the composition book out of her bag and set it on the table between them and opened it to the first relevant section. He looked at her, then he looked at the book and began to read. He read slowly. He did not hurry. He turned pages with care. He went back twice to sections he had already passed, not scanning, but actually reading, testing each figure and each argument for what it actually said, rather than what it seemed to say. When he reached the section on the differential markups, his pace slowed further, and she saw a small involuntary motion in his left hand, a barely visible closing of the fingers, the kind of motion that happens when something confirms what a person has been quietly forming inside themselves. He read through to the most recent entries. He went back and read 3 pages a second time. Then he sat back and was quiet, in the sustained way of a person sorting through the full weight of something, before deciding how to be honest about it. When he finally spoke, he used her name with deliberateness. "Miss Hollins," he said, "do you understand what you have built here?" "I have figures," she said. "The full scope is still not complete." "What you have," he said, "is a methodically documented pattern of a merchant overcharging a specific category of client, consistently and deliberately, across a significant period of time. And you have documented it with more rigor than most formally trained examiners would manage." He paused. "I have seen official complaint documents assembled by people with professional credentials and institutional resources that were less precise than what is in this composition book." She picked up her tea. "What had you been considering doing with it?" he said. "I have not yet decided. I am still extending the reconstruction backward through time. The period I have documented firmly is 18 months. I believe the pattern is older than that." He was quiet again for a moment. "When you have established the full scope," he said carefully, "it might be useful to think through what comes next in a setting where someone who understands what they are looking at is present. I am not trying to direct you toward any particular choice. Only to say that thinking through something this serious entirely alone is a particular kind of difficulty, and it is not the only way." She considered this on the walk home. She had been carrying the composition book and everything in it entirely alone for months. Not from choice, but from necessity. Because she had not known until now anyone who would understand what they were looking at if she showed it to them. Now she did. She would come back to Ellis Street, and she would bring the book. She spent the second and third weeks of the 6-week reconstruction working specifically on Mrs. Pratt's account, because it was the account with the highest individual figures and the most consistent presence across the period she was reconstructing, and because she had gathered more fragments about it than about the other two. Holt had mentioned Mrs. Pratt's account in her hearing 4 times in the past year and a half, each time in the context of a fabric sale, and each time she had been able to record at least one verifiable figure from the exchange. She had also been able to observe Mrs. Pratt's purchases directly on 3 of her 5 visits to the shop, which gave her both the buyer and the product, and the price quoted. The pattern on Mrs. Pratt's account was the most extreme she had documented. Every purchase she had records for showed a markup above 40%. The most recent one, the Belgian wool in November, had been 41%. An earlier purchase of ivory silk had been 44% by her best estimate. A purchase of French lace that she had observed only partially, catching the price quoted and the product, but not the full invoice detail, put the markup somewhere between 38 and 42%. She thought about why Mrs. Pratt's account would carry the highest markups. The answer, when she considered it carefully, was not complicated. Mrs. Pratt was a widow on a fixed income, who asked careful questions about quality, but who did not have, as far as Cora could observe, any independent knowledge of wholesale pricing. She relied entirely on the merchant's representation of value. She was a loyal client of long standing. She trusted the shop. That trust, combined with her lack of external pricing information, and combined with the fixed nature of her income, which meant that any given expenditure represented a larger proportional cost to her than it might to a wealthier client, made her the ideal target for the highest markups. She would not know the difference, she could not check, and she would keep coming back because she trusted the place and had no reason not to. Cora held this analysis in the composition book and then read it back and tested it for places where she was overreading the evidence. She was not overreading. The pattern was what it was. She had documented it carefully and across enough instances that the explanation she had arrived at was the most consistent one available. The total she assembled for the 3 accounts, across 3 years, sat on the page, and she looked at it for a long time. $2,240. She had expected a large number. She had not been fully prepared for the specific and unambiguous largeness of this one. She thought about what else it might explain. In the weeks since she had overheard Holt's satisfaction about the Pratt place on the East Road, she had been thinking carefully about what she knew, and what she did not know, and where the line between them fell. She knew that a parcel on the East Road had been discussed as available because an owner needed to raise funds. She knew that Holt had spoken of its availability with satisfaction. She knew that Mrs. Pratt's account showed the highest overcharges of any of the 3 accounts she had documented. She did not know with certainty that the parcel was Mrs. Pratt's. She did not know with certainty that the reason Mrs. Pratt might need to raise funds was connected to what she had been paying at Holt's shop. She was honest with herself about these limits, with the same discipline she applied to the distinction between confirmed and estimated figures in the composition book. But she knew how money worked in a household managed on a fixed income over 3 years of gradual invisible depletion. She knew what it looked like from the outside, the careful management of a finite resource that was being depleted at a rate slightly faster than it was being sustained, so that the cushion compressed year by year without any single moment of crisis, until the moment arrived when an assessment was made and a decision was required about what could and could not be sustained going forward. A piece of land was a particular kind of asset. It was not liquid. It was not what you sold first, or second, or third. It was what you sold when the other things had been used, and the cushion had compressed to the point where the land was the resource available. When a woman on a modest fixed income sold farmland that her husband had left her, she was telling you something about the trajectory of the preceding years, even if she could not tell you why the trajectory had been what it was. She wrote these thoughts in the interpretive section, carefully, marked as inference rather than established fact. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote the total again at the top. $2,240. The number sat on the page and did not apologize for itself. She thought about Dupree's library on the walk home from Ellis Street after her first visit there, and she kept thinking about it on subsequent evenings at the pine table, in a way that was not entirely about the books. The books were useful, but the library itself, and the person who had assembled it, and the manner in which he had offered access to it, were something she kept returning to. She had met people who were thoughtful about the situation of the community she was part of. She had met people who were active in its networks and institutions. She had met people who were smart and careful and genuinely committed to the work of building something durable. What she had not often met was someone who thought about the problem of economic knowledge with the same combination of precision and patience that she had come to associate with the best kind of practical thinking. People who talked about economic independence as an abstract principle were common. People who thought about it in the specific and methodological way that Dupree did, from the ground up, from the individual transaction and the individual account, and what a person needed to know in order to navigate them without being deceived, were considerably less common. She recognized in him, over the Saturdays at Ellis Street, a way of thinking about the same problems she had been thinking about since Ruth had given her the word read in the quiet. He had arrived at his understanding from a different direction, through decades of advocacy and printing and teaching, and watching what happened to communities when the people in them could and could not understand their own finances. She had arrived at hers through a torn Bible and an arithmetic primer, and 2.5 years in a back room. But the understanding they had reached was the same understanding, and there was something in recognizing it in another person, after the years of carrying it alone, that was unexpectedly grounding. The work of extending the reconstruction backward through 3 full years took her 6 weeks of evenings at the pine table, 6 weeks of the same systematic daily routine at the shop, applied to a longer time horizon and a thinner record. The recent period was dense and reliable. The older material had to be assembled from fragments, overheard references to past transactions that Holt occasionally made in conversation, old invoices that had been reused as scratch paper in the workroom, and that retained the original figures on their undersides. The consistent application of the confirmed pattern to the earlier period, where direct observation was not possible. She was strict with herself about the difference between what she had confirmed and what she had inferred, marking every estimated figure with its triangle and every verified figure with its square, because the integrity of the reconstruction depended on that distinction being preserved throughout. A document that did not know the difference between what it was certain of and what it was guessing at was a document that could not be trusted, and she intended this document to be trustworthy. She worked on 3 accounts specifically. Agnes Whitfield, a widow of approximately 70, small and careful in her movements, with the self-contained composure of someone who had made her peace with the gap between what she had expected and what life had provided, and who had stopped expecting the gap to close. She lived on the income from a small rental property on the south side of the city, a pair of rooms that had belonged to her husband, and that she managed with the visible care of someone who understood perfectly well that the income was finite and did not accumulate. She came into Holt's shop approximately 3 times a year. Each visit Cora had observed the same careful deliberation, the same methodical questions about quality and durability, the same specific attention to price. She was not a careless buyer. She was a thorough one. The overcharge on Agnes Whitfield's account across the 3 years of the reconstruction, checked 3 times on 3 separate pages, was $712. Dorothy Marsh, a woman in her early 50s with the smooth and slightly removed quality of someone whose life had proceeded in sufficient comfort, that comfort had become invisible to her. Her husband had been a physician. He was dead now some years. She managed his estate, which seemed from her manner to be adequate without being extravagant, and she bought fabric regularly, 4 times a year or so, always for well-made garments for the social obligations that composed her public life. She came to Holt's because her mother had come to Holt's, because it was where their household had always bought fabric, because there had been no reason to question it. That kind of trust, the trust built not from any positive assessment, but from the simple absence of a reason to doubt, was the most reliable trust a merchant could have. It required no maintenance. It offered no warning. The overcharge on Dorothy Marsh's account across 3 years was $721. Mrs. Aldine Pratt, the account Cora had been tracking most closely, the one with the highest individual figures, and the most consistent presence in the records she had been able to access. She knew Mrs. Pratt in the way she knew others in the community she moved through, not through close personal acquaintance but through accumulated observation, across multiple contexts, across several years. She had seen her at the AME church, where she occupied a seat near the front, with the steady reliability of someone for whom attendance was a settled matter, and not a choice, remade weekly. She had seen her at the shop on 5 occasions in the past 18 months, and on each occasion had observed the particular quality of her attention to what she was buying. The questions precise, the handling careful, the final decision made after genuine consideration of the factors that mattered. Mrs. Pratt was not a woman who bought without thought. She was a woman for whom thought was the prerequisite of every expenditure, because she understood that what she had was finite, and that every choice she made about it was consequential. The overcharge on Mrs. Pratt's account across 3 years, checked 3 times, was $807. Total across all 3 accounts, $2,240. She sat with that figure for a long time on the January Friday evening, when it finally assembled itself clearly on the page. The candle burned from its midpoint past the halfway mark. She did not write anything else. She simply held the number in the context of what she knew about the 3 women it represented. $2,240, taken in increments too small in any individual transaction to constitute an obvious alarm, across years long enough that the accumulation had been invisible from inside it. $2,240, taken from women who had asked careful questions and received answers that were technically accurate and completely misleading, who had trusted and been given every reason to trust and no reason to suspect, whose trust had been treated as a resource to be drawn on rather than a relationship to be honored. 3 weeks earlier, she had overheard something she had noted without yet understanding. Holt had been at the back door speaking to someone she did not recognize, the exchange mostly blocked by the workroom wall, and the only piece that had carried clearly to her was Holt's voice in a particular register she now recognized. The register of a man registering a transaction resolved in his favor, saying that the Pratt place on the East Road was going to be available after all. She had written it down. She took that note out now and placed it beside something else she had recorded 4 months earlier. An overheard exchange between Holt and a man named Graves, a land agent, about a parcel on the East Road, 14 acres of former farming land, being brought to market because the owner needed to raise funds. She did not have proof of the connection. She was honest with herself about this, as she was honest about everything that lived at the edge of what she could establish. She did not know with certainty that the East Road parcel was Mrs. Pratt's land. She did not know with certainty that the need to raise funds was connected to 3 years of being overcharged in increments too small to name individually. But she knew what a $2,000 extraction distributed invisibly across 3 years did to a woman managing a fixed income with careful attention. You did not see it in any single month. You saw it only when you looked back over a longer span and found that the cushion you believed you were maintaining had compressed in ways you could not account for. You had been careful. You had not been extravagant. And yet things were tighter than they should have been, and you could not say why. And at some point, you looked at what you were holding and decided what you could no longer afford to hold. A piece of land that a husband had worked was not the same as money. When it went in a way that money did not go, because money could be earned again, and land on the East Road was simply gone. She put the pencil down. She had not cried since Ruth died. She was not crying now. She sat at the pine table very still, and felt something move through her chest that was not grief exactly, and was not anger exactly, but lived in the space between them, the deep and specific ache of knowing something that the people it most concerned could not know without her. Her mother's voice came, as it always came in the darkest and most still moments, not as sentiment, but as the living residue of a clear-minded person. Carry it carefully, not too fast, be sure. She was sure. The reconstruction was as complete as she could make it from where she stood. She knew what she had, and she knew it accurately, within the stated limits of the methodology she had applied throughout. She needed to decide what to do with it. She could not put it down. She had understood this for some time, in the way you understand something you have been circling around without looking directly at it. She had built the picture with the assumption, somewhere underneath the methodical daily work of building it, that the picture was going to require a response from her. You did not spend months documenting something like this with the intention of closing the book and going on as before. She had not been naive enough to believe that was where this ended. She sat in the dark until the window began to show the earliest suggestion of the coming morning, and then she stood and looked out at Telfair Street below, quiet and empty at this hour, looking like nothing in particular had happened on it. She would not go on alone. She would go to Ellis Street. She told him about Mrs. Pratt and the East Road land. She told him carefully, with the same discipline she applied to the distinction between what she knew and what she had inferred, marking clearly which parts of the account were established by the figures in the composition book, and which parts were connections she had drawn between facts that were individually solid and jointly suggestive. Dupree listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He said that the connection she had drawn was not proof in the formal sense, that she was right to mark it as inference rather than established fact, but that it was exactly the kind of inference that a formal examination of the full records would be in a position to either confirm or rule out. If the examination could establish the total overcharge on Mrs. Pratt's account, and if that total corresponded to a financial compression that would explain decisions she had made about her assets during the relevant period, that correspondence would itself be evidence of something, not proof of intent, but evidence of consequence, which was its own category and not an unimportant one. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said that she understood the distinction between the two kinds of evidence, that she was not trying to establish intent in the composition book, She was trying to establish the fact of the overcharge and its consistency. Intent was a conclusion that followed from the fact of the overcharge and its structure, and it was a conclusion she was prepared to let a formal examiner draw from the facts she could document. He said that was the right way to think about it. She said that she had been thinking about the 3 paths he had described, and that she had been thinking about them with the specific seriousness of someone who understood that each path closed certain doors and opened others, and that the opening and closing happened permanently, rather than provisionally. She was not looking for reassurance. She was describing the quality of the deliberation. He said that he understood. She said that she had been thinking specifically about the women, about what each of the 3 paths gave them, and what it cost them. The first path gave them nothing, and cost them the knowledge that what had been done to them had been understood and documented and then set aside. The second path gave them the knowledge at the cost of the remedy, which was a cost she was not willing to impose on them. The third path gave them the possibility of the remedy, but at a risk that fell entirely on the person taking the path and not on them. The risk that fell on her. She had been thinking about this risk in the specific way that she thought about problems she intended to solve, not with the frozen quality of fear, but with the analytical quality of someone identifying variables. The risk was real. She was not going to minimize it. She was a black woman in Augusta, Georgia, in 1888, and the risk of being identified as the source of a formal complaint against a white merchant was a risk that extended well beyond the loss of employment. She had known this since the beginning. She had not let it stop her from building the record. But there was a difference between building a record and sending it somewhere, and she was standing at that difference now. She thought about what her mother would say. Ruth had not been a person who encouraged unnecessary risk. She had been a person who distinguished carefully between risks that were avoidable and risks that were the necessary cost of doing what needed to be done, and who had taught Cora, by example rather than instruction, that the second kind of risk was a different thing from the first. The first kind of risk you avoided when you could. The second kind you accepted when the thing that needed doing was genuinely important. She looked at the composition book open on the table between them. $2,240. 3 women. A piece of farmland on the East Road. She said, "Help me write the letter." There were things she needed to get right before a word of the letter was written. She needed to understand the formal structure of a complaint to the Board of Trade, the specific categories of information required, the standard of documentation expected, the language conventions that distinguished a document a board examiner would treat as serious from a document that would be treated as the product of a grievance without evidentiary grounding. She spent the following 2 evenings reading the relevant sections of the regulatory history text and the case summaries from Dupree's library, working through them with the same focused attention she brought to learning any new technical material. By the time she sat down across from Dupree on the first of the 11 evenings, she knew what the letter needed to do, and she had a clear idea of how to do it. She was ready to begin. She had, over the months of building the reconstruction, developed a particular relationship with the figures in the composition book. They were not abstract to her. Each number corresponded to a specific moment, a specific transaction, a specific choice made by a specific person about a fabric or a garment that they wanted, and that they were paying what they believed was a fair price for. The numbers in the composition book were not statistics. They were the residue of trust, each one representing a moment when a woman had placed her reliance in a merchant who had decided to use that reliance against her. She thought about this reliance in the evenings of the 6 weeks she spent extending the reconstruction. Trust in the context of a merchant transaction was not an emotional thing in the way it sometimes was in personal relationships. It was a practical thing, a substitution you made when you could not verify something yourself. You could not verify the fair price of Belgian wool from a supplier in Brussels. You did not have access to wholesale pricing. You did not have the trade relationships or the industry knowledge to determine independently whether what you were being charged bore any reasonable relationship to what the merchant had paid. So you trusted. You trusted, because trust was the only practical option available to you. The merchant knew this. He knew it the way you know the practical limits of the people you deal with, not through any specific assessment in any particular transaction, but through the accumulated experience of a long career in which the limits had been confirmed repeatedly. He knew that certain clients could not check. He knew that knowing they could not check was what made the overcharge possible. She wrote none of this explicitly in the composition book, The composition book was for figures, for documented facts, for the clear and verifiable record. The interpretation belonged in a separate section she had designated for it, and she had written what she was able to establish there with care. But she held the full analysis in her mind, and the full analysis was this. What was documented in the composition book was not an accident or an oversight. It was a system, built by someone who understood the vulnerabilities of the people he was exploiting, and who had organized his business practice around those vulnerabilities. She held this conclusion for a long time, before she wrote it in the interpretive section, because she wanted to make certain it was supported by the evidence before she committed to it in writing. It was supported. The composition book was full. She was ready to talk to Dupree about what came next. Charles Dupree laid out the 3 options on a February Saturday morning in the back room of the printing press, and he laid them out with the specific care of a person who understands that the weight of a serious decision is not lightened by softening the description of what the decision involves. The stove was burning. The cold winter light came through the small window above the table. The composition book was open between them. Outside the window, Ellis Street was moving through its Saturday morning in the modest, purposeful way of a commercial street on a cold day. People with places to be, moving toward them without lingering. Cora had arrived at 11 and shown him the completed reconstruction. He had read the new pages with the same careful attention he had brought to the first reading, checking her arithmetic on the final total against a scrap of paper, and when he looked up, he had been quiet for long enough that she understood the weight had reached him. "There are 3 paths," he said. "I want to be plain about all 3. She was listening. She had come to listen to him carefully, not because she deferred to his judgment, but because she had found his judgment worth serious attention, which was not the same thing. "The first path is silence," he said. "You close the composition book. You go on as you have been. The information stays inside what you have built and inside yourself and does not go anywhere beyond that. The risk to you on this path is the lowest of the 3. The cost is what you will carry forward. Everything you know about what has been done to those 3 women, and the knowledge that you chose not to use what you built. That cost is real, and it does not diminish with time in my experience. But it is a cost some people have managed, and I will not pretend otherwise." She had thought about this path extensively. She had sat with it on many evenings, and on walks to and from the shop, and in the early mornings, before the candle was lit. She knew its shape. She understood what it would feel like on the first day of choosing it, and she had some understanding of what it would feel like in the 5th year. "The second path," Dupree said, "is to reach the 3 women directly, to find a way to communicate what you know to the people most affected, without going through any formal process. There are ways this could be done without your name being explicitly attached." He considered his next words. "The advantage is that the women would know. They would have the information. The disadvantages are several. Any one of the 3 could mention the source of what she learned, without any intention of causing harm, because people talk, and if word reached Holt that someone had been watching his accounts and building a record of them, you would be the most obvious candidate to examine. You would lose your position immediately, and probably more than that. And even if the risk were managed successfully, the women would have knowledge but no recourse. They would know what had been done to them without any means of recovering what had been taken. Knowledge of harm without the ability to address it is not a neutral thing to carry. In my experience, it can make the original injury heavier rather than lighter." She had thought about this too, and specifically about Mrs. Pratt, about what it would mean to deliver to that woman the precise information that she had been systematically overcharged for 3 years, with no mechanism attached for recovering any of it. That was not a gift, that was a burden with a bow on it, and she was not willing to hand that to a woman who had already given up something she could not get back. "The third path," Dupree said, "is to take what you have built to someone with the formal authority to do something about it. The Georgia State Board of Trade holds licensing authority over merchant businesses in this state. A properly constructed complaint with supporting documentation that meets their evidentiary threshold could compel a formal audit. A formal audit conducted by an examiner of actual integrity could produce restitution for the affected clients and formal action against the merchant's license." He paused. "The risk on this path is the highest of the 3. You would need to protect your identity very carefully, because the moment an investigation begins, the question of who had access to this information and the capacity to document it will be asked, and your position in that building makes you an obvious answer. Even with your identity protected, there is no guarantee the board acts. The board is made up of men who share more in common with Edwin Holt than with you or the women he has been overcharging. A complaint from an unknown source, however well documented, is easy to dismiss if the person receiving it finds dismissal convenient. And convenience and the path of least resistance are closely related. He stopped. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Which examiner on the board has the record of acting on well-documented complaints, regardless of the standing of the person being complained against?" He was quiet in the particular way that told her he had been waiting for this question. "Frederick Crane," he said, 11 years on the board. His record of actions taken against merchants spans a significant range of cases and has not been selective about the social prominence of the merchants involved. Every professional account I have gathered of him describes the same quality. He follows evidence where it leads, without much attention to where that happens to be. That is a specific quality, and a rare one in that position after that many years. "You have already looked into this," she said. "I have been hoping you would arrive here," he said, without apology. "I did not try to move you toward it, but I did not want to be unprepared when you came." She held his gaze. He returned it without deflection. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough for the stove to make its small settling sounds, long enough for the street outside to cycle through several ordinary moments. She thought about her position in full, a black woman in Georgia in 1888, without formal credentials, without institutional standing, without any of the protections that money or family or social position provided against a man with a business and a lawyer, and a settled position in the community. She knew exactly what she was risking. She had known what she was risking since the first Tuesday she stood at Holt's open ledger. She had not stopped then. She thought about what her mother had given her, letter by letter, from a torn Bible, in the specific conviction that it would be needed for exactly this kind of moment. She thought about what it meant to have that tool, and to have used it to understand what she understood, and then to choose, because the consequences of using it were dangerous, to use it for nothing. She could not find the version of herself that could live inside that choice. She thought about Aldine Pratt and the farmland on the East Road. She thought about Agnes Whitfield managing a compressed income whose compression she could not explain. She thought about Dorothy Marsh, whose comfortable trust in a long-standing merchant had been the precise mechanism used to take from her. She said, "Help me write the letter." Dupree uncapped his pen. He pulled a clean sheet of paper toward himself from the stack he had already placed within reach. He said, "Tell me where you want to begin." She told him. She knew exactly where she wanted to begin. The question of the signature had occupied her for several evenings before they resolved it. The obvious solution was an anonymous document, something without any attribution at all, the kind of complaint that a board would receive and treat as potentially credible or potentially mischievous, depending on how it struck the examiner who read it. She did not like the obvious solution. An anonymous document said nothing about the person who had written it, which meant it also said nothing about the quality of the knowledge behind it. A document signed by a concerned party, with knowledge of the accounts, said something specific, that there was a person, that the person had knowledge, and that the knowledge was connected to the accounts, rather than to some external grievance or competitive interest. It was a minimal disclosure that was also a meaningful one. They had also discussed the question of whether to attach the composition book pages directly to the letter. Dupree had proposed this initially. Cora had thought about it for 2 days and concluded against it. The composition book was in her handwriting, organized in her shorthand, full of the kind of specific and repeated detail that would make it immediately apparent to a careful reader that the author of the document had been present in Holt's business for an extended period. The composition book was evidence, and it was also, if examined closely by someone who was looking for the source of the complaint rather than the substance of it, a reasonably detailed portrait of the person who had kept it. She would provide the figures in clean tabular form, organized by category, with the sources noted clearly, but without the full documentation that would make it possible to identify the author before any formal protection was in place. The 11 evenings were also, in ways she had not fully expected, illuminating about the nature of the collaboration itself. Dupree was a skilled writer of formal documents. He had a command of the language of official correspondence that came from decades of practice, and his instinct for structure was sound. But his instinct for figures was different from hers, not worse exactly, but less precise, in the specific way that mattered for this document, which was the precision of someone who had built the figures from scratch over months, and who knew exactly where each one was solid and where it was soft, and who would not allow those two categories to be blended in the presentation. On the fifth evening, she stopped him on a passage that described the freight credit figures as conclusively demonstrating the absence of the credit from the accounts. She told him that conclusively demonstrating was an overclaim. What she had was a confirmed absence from the specific pages of the ledger she had been able to read, and a consistent absence from any subsequent conversation or document she had been able to access. These two things together were strong evidence. They were not conclusive proof. A formal examiner who read a document that overclaimed its certainty would find that the overclaim weakened everything around it. Dupree had looked at her for a moment after she said this, and then he had looked at the draft, and then he had crossed out the overclaiming phrase and replaced it with something more precise. By the eighth evening, the document was strong in the way she had been aiming for, precise where it was certain, calibrated where it was estimated, clear about the distinction between the two, and organized in a way that an examiner with genuine intelligence would find rigorous rather than credulous. The final reading through took place on the 11th evening. They sat across from each other, and she read every sentence aloud, and he listened, and when she was done, he said that it was the strongest complaint document he had seen in his years of working with official processes, which had been many. She said that she hoped Frederick Crane would agree. Dupree said that Crane would at minimum be required to take it seriously, which was more than could be said of most of what crossed the board's desk. She sealed the letter. The waiting afterward was its own discipline. She had known it would be. She had thought about waiting as a thing to be managed rather than a thing to be endured, which was the way she thought about all difficult things that were not immediately solvable. You identified what you could control during the waiting period, which was your own work and your own conduct, and you focused your attention there. You did not spend your attention where you could not affect anything. She spent it on the tablecloths, on the coat alterations, on the general care of the work in her basket. She spent it on the accounting primer, which she continued to work through during the evenings at the pine table, because there was always more to learn, and because keeping her mind engaged with specific and demanding material was a better use of the waiting hours than anything else available to her. She checked the figures in the composition book on 3 evenings during the waiting period, not because she believed they would have changed, but because reviewing them gave her a concrete way of staying connected to the actual substance of what she had done, which was useful against the tendency of waiting to make everything feel abstract and uncertain. The figures were still correct. The letter was in Frederick Crane's office. What happened next was not in her hands. She went on working. She had one more experience at the shop in the 2 weeks between the conversation with Dupree and the evening she arrived at her decision, and it was an experience that made the decision easier to arrive at than she had expected it to be. On a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February, Aldine Pratt came into the shop. She came in to return a piece of fabric she had bought the previous month that had turned out to have a flaw in the weave that only became apparent when she began cutting it. She brought the full bolt back, with the flaw marked precisely, and she set it on the counter and explained the problem to Holt in the specific, non-confrontational way of someone who expects the problem to be resolved without drama, but who is not going to let it go unaddressed. Holt examined the flaw, said that he was sorry and that this was unusual for that supplier, and offered her a replacement bolt or a credit against a future purchase. Mrs. Pratt thanked him and said she would take the credit. Holt wrote the credit note himself and signed it and handed it to her, and she folded it and placed it in her bag and thanked him and turned to go. As she turned, her eyes passed across the workroom doorway. She could not have known Cora was watching. Cora had not moved from her table, but their eyes met for a moment across the space between them, and Mrs. Pratt gave a small, formal nod, the nod of two people who recognize each other in a community without knowing each other well, and Cora nodded back. Then, Mrs. Pratt was gone. Cora sat with the needle in her lap and did not immediately resume sewing. She was thinking about the credit note. Holt had written the credit note himself, and the amount on it was the full price Mrs. Pratt had paid for the bolt. The full price. The price that included the 41% markup, above what fair pricing would have produced. He had given her back all of it, not because of any principle of fairness, but because it was a visible transaction, a flaw that she had documented and returned in person, a situation in which not giving her back the full price would have produced an obvious and immediate complaint. He was not careless about visible things. He was extremely careful about visible things. The systematic overcharge was possible precisely because it was invisible, because the gap between the fair price and the charged price was never visible in any individual transaction to the person on the receiving end of it. She thought about Mrs. Pratt walking out of the shop with the credit note in her bag, receiving back in full the money she had paid for a flawed piece of fabric, having no idea that the price she had paid for that piece of fabric had been 41% above what it should have been, having no idea that across 3 years of shopping in this establishment, she had paid $807 more than she should have paid. She thought about what it meant to be the person who knew this. She thought about what it meant to be the person who could do something about it. She had been deliberating for 2 weeks. She had been deliberating long enough. On a Saturday morning, she walked to Ellis Street and sat across from Dupree and said, "Help me write the letter." What she had decided was this. The risk was real, and she would carry it. The women had not asked to be helped, and would not know they were being helped, which was a quality of the situation she had come to terms with, because the alternative was to let the harm go unaddressed, and she could not do that. She had not spent 2.5 years building a record in the specific hope that she would eventually be able to set it aside and go on as before. She had spent 2.5 years building a record because the record needed to exist, and it needed to exist because what it documented needed to be addressed. She had her reasons. They were sound. She would carry the consequences. She was ready. The letter took 11 evenings to produce in its final form, not because the material was obscure. Cora had the figures organized to a degree of precision that would have satisfied a professional auditing firm, not because Dupree lacked command of formal correspondence. He had been writing to official bodies for 3 decades and understood how such documents needed to be structured, what language carried institutional weight, and what language invited dismissal by a reader looking for a reason to dismiss. The 11 evenings were necessary because they were not simply writing a complaint. They were constructing a document designed to survive a very specific kind of hostile reading, the reading of someone who begins by looking for the most defensible reason to set the document aside, and who needs to find, instead, that every paragraph has already anticipated the objection and addressed it, that every figure has its source clearly noted, that every methodological choice has been explained transparently enough that a skeptical reader can verify it independently, rather than taking it on faith. This was harder than it sounded. It required a discipline that is the inverse of the discipline usually needed in argument, not the discipline of building the strongest possible case for what you believe to be true, but the discipline of reading your own work from the perspective of someone who wants it to be wrong, and then fixing the things they would most easily be right about. They worked on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the back table in the printing press, with the composition book between them, and clean paper stacked at Dupree's right hand. He drafted. Cora read each section as it was written, checked every figure against its source, and responded when the language did not capture the precision the situation required. He had expected, she came to understand over the first 2 evenings, a degree of deference from her on the writing, that her contribution would be the figures, and his contribution would be the framing, and that these 2 contributions would not frequently overlap. What he had not anticipated was how clearly she understood the difference between a paragraph that was accurate and a paragraph that was accurate in a way a careful examiner would find compelling, or how firmly she would distinguish between them when it mattered. By the 3rd evening, he had understood the actual nature of the collaboration they were in, and after that, the work moved more efficiently, each of them contributing what they brought most strongly without friction, about the boundary between those contributions. He wrote the formal structure and the procedural language. She contributed the arithmetic, the specific logic of the reconstruction methodology, and the analysis of why the pattern was a pattern rather than a coincidence. This last contribution was the one she was most insistent on getting exactly right, because it was the part a skeptical examiner would test first and most rigorously. She could not simply assert that the differential billing was systematic and deliberate. She had to show why it was structurally consistent with deliberate choice and structurally inconsistent with error, and she had to do this without overclaiming, in a way that would expose the argument to dismissal for overstating what the evidence could bear. The first 2 pages described the irregularities in plain language organized by category. The missing freight credit, Stated figure, stated basis, documented period of absence. Specific reason the absence was significant, given the size of the credit and the carefulness of the merchant's operations in other areas. The differential billing pattern, documented examples in tabular format with sources, comparison to the mail client data. The pattern that emerged from that comparison, described without interpretation, laid out so that the pattern spoke for itself. The next 2 pages addressed the methodology, how the parallel account had been constructed, what the data sources were, and what their limitations were, where the figures were confirmed versus estimated, and on what basis each estimation rested, how an independent examiner with access to the actual records could verify each element of what the document contained. These pages took the longest to get right, and the reason they took the longest was the one Cora had identified from the beginning, a document transparent about its methodology and its limitations, that invited verification rather than demanding belief, was a different kind of document from one that overclaimed. It was a document that respected the examiner's intelligence. Respected examiners paid it back. The final 2 pages addressed the affected accounts in sufficient specific detail that an examiner would be able to locate the relevant records on the first attempt. The clients were not named by name, for their protection, but the account categories, the time periods, the nature of the overcharges, and the approximate figures were present and precise. The letter was signed, a concerned party with knowledge of the accounts. They had considered more elaborate signings and rejected each of them. The phrase they chose was honest. It acknowledged that there was a person behind the document, that the document had been assembled from specific knowledge and not constructed in the air, without providing any information that could be used to identify the source before the formal process had advanced far enough to offer some protection. Dupree's connection in the AME network, a man named Leonard with professional ties to the Board of Trade's administrative operations, could deliver the letter directly to Frederick Crane's desk, without routing it through the general correspondence intake, where it might be buried or redirected before it reached the one person on the board who might actually act on it. Leonard knew Crane by professional reputation, and had confirmed through his own experience that the reputation was accurate. On a Tuesday morning in early March, Cora brought the sealed letter to Ellis Street, before the press opened. She went to work. She sat at her station and threaded her needle and took the first piece from the basket. Holt arrived at 8. George at 5 past. A delivery came at 9:30. A client came and went at 11. The day conducted itself in its ordinary way around her. She was steady. She had expected the anxiety of exposure, the specific breathlessness of a threshold crossed that cannot be recrossed. What she felt instead was closer to calm, and she understood it after a few hours, as the calm of a person who has been deliberating for a long time and has finally acted. The deliberation was where the anxiety had lived. The action was solid ground by comparison. The letter was out of her hands. She had given it everything she had. Whether it was enough was not hers to determine. The days that followed had the particular quality of waiting that is not suspension but aftermath, where something is in motion that you cannot see, and you go on with your own work and hold the knowledge of that motion lightly enough that it does not show. She held it. She finished the commission in the basket. She took on a new one, 3 tablecloths for a client who needed them by Easter. She hemmed a coat. She altered 2 dresses. She worked at the pace she always worked, no faster and no differently, moving through the shop's ordinary days with the same quiet efficiency she had maintained for 2.5 years. On the 7th day, she considered clearly the possibility that nothing would happen, that Crane would read the letter and find it insufficient, that the board would decline to act. She had prepared herself for this before she sent the letter, and she returned to that preparation now and found it still held. The action had been right whether or not it produced what she hoped for. She had not taken the risk because she was certain of the outcome. She had taken it because the alternative was something she could not inhabit. She accepted this and kept working. On the 11th day, a letter arrived at Holt's Merchant House from the Georgia State Board of Trade. George brought it in from the Morning Post. She heard him set it on the counter. She heard Holt read it. She heard the brief silence that followed the reading, and then she heard him speak in a tone of easy dismissal that was almost completely convincing. A competitor, stirring the water. These inquiries came periodically. He would have his lawyer send a brief response, nothing to concern oneself about. She pulled a fresh thread through her needle. He had read the board's preliminary notice and seen a mild administrative inconvenience. He had not seen the 6 pages that had preceded it, sitting now on Frederick Crane's desk, assembled over months by the quiet woman in his back room whom he had described to a cotton trader, without lowering his voice, as not the thinking kind. George's position deteriorated over the course of the examination, in a way that Cora tracked from the workroom without appearing to track it. He became quieter week by week. He stopped his low murmur of self-directed arithmetic almost entirely. He began bringing his midday meal from home rather than going out for it, which meant he was in the building every hour of the working day, sitting at his counter with the concentration of someone who is staying very close to familiar ground because the terrain elsewhere has become uncertain. She had thought, in the weeks before the examination began, about whether there was anything she could do for George that would not put the full situation at risk before there was any formal protection for anyone involved. She had concluded, after careful consideration, that there was not. Anything she said to George that touched on the accounts or the examination would raise immediate questions about how she knew what she knew and what she had done with that knowledge, and those questions would produce outcomes she could not predict or control. She could not help George directly. She could only hope that Crane's report, when it came, would do the work of distinguishing between what a junior clerk's errors looked like and what this looked like. She trusted that it would. She had given Crane enough in the anonymous letter to know what to look for in making that distinction. On the days when Crane's team was in the building, she was aware of their presence as a kind of organized quiet, the focused and unhurried quality of people, engaged in professional work they had done many times. They did not interact with her. She did not interact with them. She was the seamstress in the back room. She sewed. She paid attention, however, to the quality of Holt's movements through the building on the days of the examination. He was a man who normally moved through his own space, with the specific ease of someone who owned it, and felt that ownership in his body. During the examination period, that ease was present, but strained, like a note held at exactly the right pitch, but requiring more effort to hold than it should. He was managing his appearance of normalcy with the specific effort of someone who understands that the appearance is what matters. She recognized the effort because she had been making the same kind of effort herself for 2.5 years, from the other direction. The difference was that she had been making it in the service of something she had chosen. He was making it in the service of something that was being done to him. She found no satisfaction in this comparison. It was simply accurate. The moment she remembered most clearly from the 8 weeks of the examination was not the moment she heard the confirmed figure from Crane's voice through the office door, though that moment was significant. It was a Tuesday morning in mid-May, 6 weeks into the examination, when she looked up from the piece she was working on for no particular reason, and saw George standing in the doorway between the front room and the workroom. He was not coming through. He was simply standing in the frame of it, looking at the workroom without appearing to see it, with the expression of a young man who has arrived at the understanding that things are going to happen around him that he will not be able to control, and who is trying to figure out how to be inside that understanding without losing himself in it. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he saw that she had looked up, and he gave her a small nod, the nod of two people who have been in the same space for a long time, and who acknowledge each other's presence without knowing how to say more than that. She nodded back. He went back to the front room. She looked at her work and continued. She thought about George often in the weeks after the examination concluded, and especially after the lawyer's strategy had become clear, and she had understood what position George was being placed in. She thought about what Crane's report said about the nature of the irregularities, that they were not consistent with clerical error, that they followed a directional pattern, characteristic of deliberate method, and she hoped that George had access to someone who would tell him clearly what the report said and what it meant for him. She had no way of knowing whether this happened. She was no longer in the building when the formal outcome was communicated. She knew only what Dupree was able to learn through his network, which was enough to tell her that the formal process had concluded as it had concluded, and that the outcome for George was not what Holt had planned for it to be. She was glad of this in the quiet and unsentimental way that she was glad of things that were simply correct. On the 9th evening, Dupree proposed that they include, in the methodology section, a brief explanation of how the anonymous complaints figures could be cross-verified against the actual records once a formal examination was underway. She agreed immediately. This was the element that would transform the letter from a complaint requiring belief into a complaint requiring investigation, because it told the examiner not to take the figures on faith, but to check them, and it told him where to look when he did. An examiner who followed the verification pathway the letter laid out would arrive at the figures through his own independent work, and that arrival, through a completely separate route, at the same destination, was the most powerful kind of confirmation available. She spent the better part of the 9th evening working through the specific language of that section with Dupree, making certain that every step of the verification pathway was described clearly enough to be followed by someone who had no prior familiarity with the situation, but who had full access to the records. The clarity of the verification pathway was the hardest technical writing in the letter, because it had to describe a path through someone else's records from the outside, using only the structural knowledge of how such records were organized, and the specific knowledge of where the relevant figures appeared in them. She had developed that structural knowledge from the accounting manuals. She had developed the specific knowledge from the 2.5 years at the shop. The 10th evening was spent on the final polish of the document, checking every figure, checking every argument, reading each sentence for possible ambiguity, looking for anything that a hostile reader could use as a reason to set the document aside. She found 3 places where the language, though accurate, was not as tight as it needed to be. She corrected all 3. On the 11th evening, they read the complete document aloud, from beginning to end, Cora reading and Dupree listening, and when she finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Dupree said that it was the strongest complaint document he had encountered in his many years of working with official processes. She said that she hoped it was enough. He said that it was enough to require a serious response. Whether the response was the right one depended on Frederick Crane's willingness to follow where the evidence led, and that was not something either of them could determine from outside the process. But she had given Crane something that a man of his reputation could not honestly dismiss, and that was the limit of what the letter could do. She sealed it. She had been expecting to feel relief at the sealing. What she felt was more complex than that. Something that included relief, but also included the specific awareness of a person who has just committed to a course of action, and who understands that they have passed a point beyond which retreat is no longer available. She was not frightened. She had not been frightened exactly at any point in this process, but she was aware, in the moment of sealing the letter, of the precise and irreversible nature of what she had just done. She handed it to Dupree. He said he would see to Leonard in the morning. She walked home through the March evening with the composition book under her arm, the figures still in their columns, the records still intact. The letter was finished. It was out of her hands. She had given it everything she had to give. What happened next belonged to Frederick Crane. She had thought, in the evenings before they began writing, about what she owed to the 3 women who would be the subjects of the letter, not in the sense of a personal obligation, since she had no personal relationship with any of the 3 that constituted an obligation of any particular kind, but in a broader sense. She had spent 2.5 years accumulating knowledge about what had been done to them. That knowledge had a weight that came from what it contained and from what it obligated. You could not build a record as detailed as what she had built, for as long as she had built it, and then walk away from it without experiencing the walking away as a kind of betrayal, not of the women specifically, but of the reason she had built the record in the first place. She had built it because the situation was wrong, and she had the specific and unusual ability to document that wrongness. She had that ability because her mother had given her the letters, and Mr. Porter had given her the figures, and she had spent 17 years keeping both invisible in the service of staying safe in a specific world. Staying safe was important, she did not underestimate it, but safety was not the only thing that mattered, and there were moments when the cost of staying safe was too high, relative to what staying safe required you to give up. She had arrived at one of those moments. The letter was what the moment required. The voluntary audit became compulsory in the 3rd week of April. The shift arrived in a single document that left no room for the relaxed dismissal Holt had applied to the first notice. The April communication named a date, named Frederick Crane as the board representative, and listed the specific records required to be produced, with a specificity that told Cora, reading it secondhand through what she could hear from the workroom, that the person who had written it already had a clear sense of what they were going to find when they looked. Cora was in the workroom when George brought the April notice in. She heard the paper on the counter. She heard Holt read it. She heard him put it down with a controlled deliberateness, the sound of something being placed carefully by a person managing the impulse to do something else with it. He called his lawyer that afternoon. The lawyer arrived the following morning at 9. They were in the office together for nearly 2 hours with the door closed. Cora sewed through the whole of it. She needed to hear none of the specific words. The texture of the consultation communicated itself through the walls clearly enough. The back-and-forth rhythm of a professional laying out options to a client who is receiving them with varying degrees of resistance. The specific cadence of an exchange, in which the news is not good, and the options are not what the client had hoped for. When the lawyer left, he said nothing to George, who had spent the 2 hours at the front counter, in the particular stillness of someone who has been told not to worry, and is finding the instruction increasingly difficult to execute. George was worried. He had been worried since the first notice arrived, in the way of a young man who understands that something is happening around him that he is not being given the full picture of, and who has enough experience of working for Holt to know that the things you were not given the full picture of were typically the things most likely to affect you. He had been in the building for 14 months. He was the person in the building whose name was attached to the routine accounts work. He was young, and he was honest, and he was in exactly the position that made young, honest people useful to people with other priorities. She had seen this coming since the day Holt had described the billing irregularities to his lawyer as clerical errors by the junior clerk. She had understood then what position George was being moved into, and she had felt the specific cold anger of someone who recognizes the shape of how weight is redistributed in these situations, who it falls on and why, and who it never falls on and why. Frederick Crane arrived with 2 assistants on a Wednesday morning in late April. He was compact and self-contained, with the economy of motion of someone who had been conducting formal examinations for a long time and had reduced the process to its essential elements. He greeted Holt with civil and completely impersonal courtesy, set his team up at the large table in the office with their own paper and pens and reference materials, and began with the oldest records available, working forward in time. Holt himself moved between the office doorway and the front of the shop, and the back hallway, and the front again, in the controlled and not quite pacing way of a man who cannot find a place to stand that feels appropriate to the situation, and who is managing this with imperfect success. Cora sewed. She sewed through the first day, and the second, and the third, through the week when Crane's team returned to clarify entries, and through the following weeks when the requests for documentation became more specific, and the visits more frequent. She maintained exactly the pace and posture and manner she had maintained for 2.5 years, nothing in her presence in the workroom that was different from any other day, no variation in the rhythm of her needle that would register differently to anyone who happened to look toward the back room. Holt was not thinking about her. He was occupied with the men in his office, and with his lawyer, and with the specific shape of what was being assembled from his records by people who had been given the formal authority to assemble it. He was not yet thinking about where the anonymous letter had come from. In the second week of the examination, the quality of George's presence in the shop began to change. He spent more time at the front counter than was necessary. He was less inclined to his usual low murmur of self-directed accounting. He sat very still sometimes, for minutes at a stretch, which was not characteristic of him. On a Thursday afternoon, she heard him in the small storage room beside the front counter, moving things quietly, and she recognized from the sound of it that he was not looking for anything. He was simply occupying a room that was not the main room, giving himself somewhere to be. She understood what was happening to him. She had understood since April what the plan was, and she understood now that George was beginning to feel the weight of it being placed on him, whether through a direct conversation she had not been positioned to hear, or through the accumulation of signals that only needed a certain amount of intelligence to read. On a Friday afternoon in early June, Crane's team was in the office with what appeared to be the final consolidation of their findings. The door was not completely closed. Crane's voice was dry and precise, the voice of a man who had been working with figures for a long time and had no need of affect to convey the weight of what he was reporting. He said to his assistant that the discrepancy in the client billing accounts for the 3-year period under review was confirmed at $2,340. $2,340. She had calculated $2,240, a difference of $100. She had missed a category somewhere in the older period of the reconstruction, where her data had been thinner. She would have liked to know specifically where, But the gap between her figure and Crane's was not significant in any way that mattered. What mattered was that the independent formal examination of the actual records and the parallel account, assembled from the outside over months by a woman at a pine table, had arrived at the same conclusion. Holt's lawyer spent the rest of that Friday in the office. By the end of the day, they had their formal response ready. The billing irregularities were the result of clerical errors accumulated by the junior accounts clerk over the relevant period under conditions of high workload. George Ames, 22 years old, honest, working from figures Holt supplied to him, being offered as the explanation for a billing structure he had never had access to, and for a pattern of decisions he had never made. She heard it that evening, after the lawyer had gone, and the shop was closed for the weekend. She heard Holt laying out the explanation to George with the measured patience of someone who has prepared an argument carefully and intends to persuade with it. She heard George's voice, muffled through the office wall, carrying the register of a young man who is being asked to accept something he knows to be wrong and who has not yet found the words or the ground from which to refuse. She held her needle still in her lap. She could not help George from where she was, not directly, and not now. What she could do was what she had already done, which was to give Crane a document precise enough that his own report would do the work of distinguishing between what a junior clerk error looked like and what this looked like. The formal report came at the end of June. $2,340 in client billing irregularities, $890 in concerns related to the freight credit records. Combined total, $3,230. The report noted that the pattern of the billing irregularities was inconsistent with the kind of error a junior accounts clerk typically produced. Clerical errors followed statistical randomness, transpositions and missed entries, and miscalculations, distributed across different types of accounts and different time periods. The irregularities in these accounts did not do this. They followed a directional pattern applied consistently to a specific category of client over an extended period, which was the signature of method rather than mistake. The report noted, in a brief passage near the end, that the anonymous complaint document received prior to the investigation had described the structure of these irregularities with a precision suggesting access to the business's operations over an extended period and an analytical capability not commonly found in accidental observation. Crane did not pursue the question of the complaint's author. His mandate was the accounts. The accounts were what they were. Holt was given his choice. A public license hearing before the full Board of Trade, open proceedings, all records available for examination, outcome not guaranteed. Or full restitution to the identified clients within 60 days, and a formal warning recorded permanently on his merchant's license. He chose restitution within 3 days. The calculation was not difficult for a man of his intelligence. A public hearing would put Crane's report before the full board in a setting designed for exactly this kind of examination, and the anonymous letter that had seeded the investigation would become an active subject of inquiry. He had been asking himself for weeks who had been in a position to write that letter. A public hearing would give that question more time and more scrutiny than he wanted it to have. He paid. And then he began trying to reconstruct what had happened. The first month on Ellis Street was the month she understood what she had been working toward for 2.5 years, not just the specific goal of the letter, and the examination, and the restitution, but the broader thing beneath it. She had spent 2.5 years in a back room, being genuinely useful to a man who held her entirely in contempt, doing work that was genuinely skilled for an employer who categorized her as a simple pair of hands attached to nothing of consequence. She had endured this not because she could not do otherwise, but because the doing otherwise required first the understanding of what she was enduring and what it was worth fighting against, and the building of that understanding had taken the full 2.5 years. What she had on Ellis Street was something different, not a different kind of work. She was still sewing, she was still doing accounts, she was still doing precisely the things she had been doing at Holt's, but she was doing them in a space that was hers, for people who had come to her on the basis of what she was known to be able to do, in an arrangement where her judgment was the relevant judgment and her assessment of the work was the one that mattered. The difference was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It showed up in small things, in the fact that she could arrange the table the way she wanted it and leave it that way, in the fact that she could decide the order in which she took on commissions without having to weight that decision against someone else's priorities, in the fact that when a client came to her with a problem, She could give them her honest assessment, rather than the assessment that was consistent with the shop's interests. These were small freedoms individually. Together, they constituted something that felt, after 2.5 years, very large. Dupree came to the door of the upstairs room one Saturday morning in the autumn, not for a scheduled meeting, but simply to see how things were going. He stood in the doorway, with his ink-stained hands in his pockets, and looked at the table under the window, the composition book on one side, and the sewing basket on the other, and the accounts files that had begun to accumulate in a neat stack on the shelf above the table. He looked at all of this for a moment, and then he looked at Cora. He said that it was good to see. She said that it was good to be seen. He went back down the stairs without further ceremony, and she heard the press start up below as he went back to his own work. By the time winter came, she had a small but consistent practice. The sewing work was the more visible part of it, because sewing was something that people understood and could recommend in specific terms. This woman made this garment, or altered this dress, and it fit correctly, and she completed it when she said she would complete it, and charged what she said she would charge. The accounts work was less visible but more quietly transformative, because the people she helped with their books were in a position, once they understood their own numbers clearly, to make decisions they had not previously been able to make, to identify where their money was going, and whether it was going where it should be going, to understand the difference between a supplier who was charging fairly and one who was relying on their client's inability to check. Edmund Clay came back in the spring with questions about how to set up a quarterly review of his accounts, rather than just a monthly one, and she spent an afternoon showing him how to structure it. He came back again in the summer with a question about how to evaluate a supplier proposal that included a volume discount, whether the discount was actually favorable relative to the current terms, or whether it was structured in a way that would cost him more overall. She worked through the calculation with him. The discount was not favorable. He thanked her and went back and renegotiated. These were small things, but small things compounded over time were not small things. She had learned this from the composition book, from 2.5 years of watching what happened when consistent small choices were made in the same direction, across enough transactions and enough time. Small things compounded were what she was building, one session and one client and one student at a time. The composition book was on the table when Dupree's column appeared in the Sunday paper. She read it at the reading room and folded it carefully and placed it in the book. Then she sat for a long moment at the back table by the window in the late afternoon light. She thought about her mother, about Ruth teaching her letters from a torn Bible, in a silence so complete that the smell of candle wax had become permanently associated with the feeling of holding her breath. She thought about Mr. Porter and the specific pleasure of a column that balanced, the way the truth of it simply was what it was without accommodation or preference. She thought about Edwin Holt standing before an open ledger, assuming the woman in the next room had no use for what was in it. She thought about what it meant to have been given a tool and to have used it. Mrs. Calloway came to the door of the reading room and said it was closing time. Cora thanked her, gathered her things, and walked out into the August afternoon. The street was warm and ordinary. The city moved around her in its familiar way, unhurried, purposeful, full of the ordinary business of people with places to be, and work to do, and choices to make, about how to spend the finite resources they had. She was one of those people. She turned toward Ellis Street. She walked the way she always walked it, without hurrying, paying attention to the things that deserved attention, letting the familiar route do what familiar routes do, which was to let your feet handle the navigation so that your mind could do other things. By the time she reached the building, the afternoon had settled into early evening. The press was quiet below. The lamp was burning in the upstairs window. She went up. She sat down. She opened the composition book. She picked up the pencil. She began the way she had always begun, because beginning was what she did, what she had always done, what she would always do, for as long as the candle burned and the pencil moved, and the composition book held pages yet to be filled. Bank drafts were issued through the Board of Trade's administrative office to the 3 identified accounts. The clients received their money with no explanation, only the fact of it, and the board's reply to their written inquiries was that the matter was a resolved commercial account discrepancy, and that the circumstances were confidential. Agnes Whitfield received her draft, and wrote to the board, and received this reply, and spent some time, Cora imagined, turning it over in her mind and arriving at no clear understanding of what it meant, only that it was real and that the bank confirmed it. Dorothy Marsh received hers and said nothing about it publicly so far as Cora ever knew. Aldine Pratt received a draft for $487. She also wrote to the board. She also received the same letter. She had no way of understanding where $487 had come from in the post on an ordinary Tuesday in late July. She knew only that it was real, and it was hers, and it was considerably more money than she had expected on any ordinary Tuesday. She could not buy back the East Road land. It had already sold. But $487 was not nothing. It was considerably more than nothing for a woman who had been managing a compressed income without understanding why it felt compressed. Holt paid the restitution with the contained and specific fury of a man who has been maneuvered into a corner by a force he cannot see clearly enough to confront. He paid because he had been given the choice, and he had determined this was the less dangerous of the two options. He paid with a check signed by his lawyer, because he would not sign his own name on the document, acknowledging what had been found. This was not practical calculation, it was personal. He paid. And then he began. He went back through what he knew with the systematic attention he brought to inventory counts and account reconciliations. Who had been in the building over the relevant years? What conversations had taken place in which rooms and with which doors in which positions? What documents had been left in the workroom, on the cutting tables, on the desk? What sight lines existed between what spaces and whose? He asked George, at first with feigned casualness, and then with less pretense of it, about specific moments and specific documents and specific positions within the shop. George provided what he could, which was honest and limited, and did not give Holt what he was looking for. 3 days after the final payment cleared, Holt came to the back workroom in the middle of the afternoon. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the room with the precise attention of a man examining geometry. He looked at Cora's chair and its angle relative to the office doorway. He looked at the sightline from that chair to his desk, direct, unobstructed. He looked at the cutting tables and the surfaces where documents sometimes rested while being processed. He looked at the small alley window and the quality of the light it provided at the time of morning, when he typically worked with his ledger open on the table beside his desk. He held all of this in his gaze for a sustained moment. She held the stillness that she had practiced her entire adult life, the absolute absence of response that gave a person watching her nothing whatsoever to work with. He stood in the doorway for approximately 70 seconds. Then he turned and went back to his office. He did not close the door. He stood at his desk, and she heard the quality of his stillness, the focused inward quality of a man working through a specific and difficult problem with the full weight of his attention. She had perhaps a week, maybe less. She had been ready for 3 weeks. 3 weeks earlier, the evening after she had first heard Holt interrogating George about documents and positions with the careful casualness of someone building a case, she had gone to Ellis Street and told Dupree what she believed was coming. He had offered the upstairs room that same evening without hesitation. She had spoken to Nora the following week, and Nora had received the information in the straightforward way she received everything, asked when, was told, nodded, and shook hands in the kitchen. Holt came to the workroom at 9:30 on a Wednesday in August. George was at the front counter with a client. The workroom was quiet. He told her that he was reducing his alteration work and would no longer require a dedicated on-premises seamstress as of the end of the week. He said it looking at a point 6 inches to the left of her face, in a tone that was civil and controlled, and gave away nothing about its reasons. She said, "I understand. Thank you for the notice." He went back to his office. She sat for a moment with the work in her lap, then folded it precisely, set it on the table, and looked at the workroom, the cutting tables, the bolt shelves, the alley window, the hook on the door where her shawl had hung every morning for 2.5 years. On the Friday afternoon, she finished the last piece in her basket, left it folded with a note of instruction for whoever came after her, said her goodbyes to George, who looked pained and uncertain in the way of a young man who knows something is ending and does not know what it means, and walked out of Holt's merchant house. She did not look back. She walked to Ellis Street with her bag over one arm and the composition book under the other. Dupree had the room ready, small, with a good window and enough floor space for a fitting. She placed the pine table under the window, The composition book on the left side, the sewing basket on the right, sat on the stool, and looked at the arrangement. Then she lit the candle, took out the pencil, and began. The first thing she wrote was a list, not figures, what the next period needed, what she had, what she still required, what work she could take on immediately, and what would need time to build. She wrote it in the clear, confident handwriting that nobody at Holt's had ever seen, in straight lines without hesitation, the handwriting of a woman who had been writing since she was 7 years old and had had 17 years of private practice since then. The word moved through the community in the way useful information moves, person to person, specific enough to be actionable. There was a woman on Ellis Street who did fine sewing and understood accounts, who would tell you honestly what your book said, who could not be deceived because she had done the sustained work of learning not to be, and who would not deceive you because that was simply not who she was. Within a month she had 3 sewing clients and 1 accounts client, Edmund Clay, who ran a small grocery on the south side, and who arrived at the upstairs room on a Saturday afternoon, with his ledgers, and the slightly sheepish expression of a man who has maintained his own books without formal training, and suspects something is not right, but cannot locate the error. She spent the afternoon with his books. She found supplier overcharges, a recurring delivery order on which the supplier had been billing slightly above the agreed rate, relying on the safe assumption that a busy man running a small grocery did not have time to verify each invoice line against the negotiated rate. The total was $33 and some cents per month. She showed Edmund the specific lines, showed him how to set up a verification column that would catch this kind of discrepancy going forward, without adding significantly to his weekly accounting time, and left him with a method he could use independently. Edmund Clay told people about this in specific terms, which were more useful than general praise, and within 3 weeks he had mentioned her name to 4 people, 2 of whom came to Ellis Street. She began teaching that autumn. Pearl was 17, Harriet's niece, described to Cora as sharp in ways her circumstances had not yet required her to demonstrate. She arrived on Saturday mornings and worked through the arithmetic primer with the precise attention of someone for whom accuracy was intrinsically satisfying rather than a performance of diligence. When she made errors, she found them herself before Cora could point them out. This was the quality Cora had come to look for, not speed or confidence, but genuine engagement, the mind actually working with the material, rather than moving through the motions of working with it. B was 34, and she arrived with a numerical intelligence that had organized itself, in the absence of formal instruction, into its own effective but unstructured system. She had been keeping her family's accounts in her head for a decade, and what she needed was not to learn to think about money, but to be given the formal structure to make her existing thinking visible on paper and extensible beyond what memory could hold alone. Watching B integrate the formal structure with what she already knew happened over about 3 weeks, and was one of the most genuinely absorbing things Cora had witnessed. The rapid and organic consolidation of self-taught knowledge, with method, into something stronger than either would have been alone. She taught both of them the way Mr. Porter had taught her, with patience and without assumption of limitation, because she had come to understand these qualities as technical requirements of good teaching, rather than simply virtues. Impatience communicated itself to students, and became their own impatience with themselves. Assumed limitation became their own assumed limitation. You assumed capacity, and you waited for the demonstration of it, and the waiting, when done without pressure, was almost always rewarded. By the end of the following year, Pearl was keeping accounts for her mother's dressmaking business and teaching the arithmetic primer to a younger cousin on Saturday mornings. Thea had taken on the full bookkeeping for her husband's furniture repair business and was spending her own Saturday mornings teaching 2 women from the congregation the same methods Cora had taught her, adapting them for students whose starting points were different from her own, but whose capacity was equally real. By 1891, Cora was keeping accounts for 4 businesses in the Augusta community. Her sewing work was steady and varied. She was teaching, directly or through the people she had already passed the knowledge to, a growing number of women, the financial literacy that her mother had pointed her toward, with nothing but a torn Bible, and the word read in a silence, as complete as anything Cora had ever sat inside. She had not spoken publicly about Edwin Holt. She had no desire to. The facts of the examination and its outcome existed in a Board of Trade record accessible through proper channels. The 3 women had received their restitution. The merchant had his warning on file. That was the conclusion of that matter, and she had no need to narrate it further. What occupied her was the work in front of her, which was always the work in front of her, the next figure, the next seam, the next person who arrived at the table ready to be assumed capable of difficult things. In the summer of 1891, Charles Dupree wrote a column. He published it in a freedman's newspaper, with readership across several states, written with the specificity and the grounding in particular example that characterized his best work, the kind of writing that resisted the abstract, because the abstract was where the truth went soft. He wrote about women who had built economic knowledge in the post-war South, in conditions that discouraged it, and who had used that knowledge not only for themselves but for the benefit of others. He wrote it with the care of someone who understood that the general claim was only as strong as the particular case it rested on. He described, without any identifying information, a woman who had sat in a back room for 2.5 years and been regarded as incapable of understanding what happened around her, and who had used that assessment, which was an assessment about her rather than a fact about her, to observe and document, and ultimately act in a way that returned to 3 women what had been quietly and methodically taken from them across years by a man who had counted on their trust being a resource he could draw on without consequence. He ended with a sentence. He wrote, "Competence kept hidden is not competence destroyed, it is competence waiting." Cora found the column on a Sunday afternoon in the AME reading room on Broad Street, in the paper from the city to the north that the room received several days after its publication date. She was at the back table by the window, the same seat she had been in on the Sunday afternoon 3.5 years earlier when she had first noticed Charles Dupree watching her read the Chambers Manual. She read the column once and then read it again. She folded it along its original crease and placed it in the composition book, which was the 4th she had filled since leaving Holt's Merchant House. Mrs. Calloway came to let her know the reading hour was closing. Cora thanked her, gathered her things, and walked out into the August afternoon. The walk from the reading room to Ellis Street she had made enough times now that every element of it was fully known to her, every corner, every shift in the quality of the light, at different seasons and different hours, every variation in the sound of the city as the afternoon moved toward evening. She walked without hurrying and without dawdling, with the easy, purposeful step of a person who knows where they are going, and understands that the walking itself is part of what the day is made of, not merely a passage between one place and another, but its own thing, worthy of its own attention. She turned onto Ellis Street. The building was quiet, in the way it was always quiet on Sunday afternoons. The window of her upstairs room held the light of the lamp she had left burning low before she went out, a steady and particular warmth in the pale August afternoon. She went up the stairs. She sat at the table. She opened the composition book to the next blank page. Outside, Augusta finished its Sunday in the ordinary way, the late afternoon heat very slightly releasing, the street below settling toward its evening register, a child's voice somewhere, the distant sound of a gate, the ever-present suggestion of the river that you heard always when you had lived in the city long enough to stop actively not hearing it. She picked up the pencil. She began. She had always begun. The candle on the left side of the table made its small, steady light. The pencil moved across the page. She would always begin again. She thought sometimes, in the evenings at the Ellis Street table, about what Holt knew and did not know. He knew that an investigation had happened. He knew that the investigation had produced confirmed findings. He knew that he had paid restitution. He had, she believed, arrived at a strong suspicion about the source of the complaint, though suspicion was not proof, and he had no proof. He had never said anything to her directly, which told her that even if he was certain in his own mind, he understood that certainty was not the same as the ability to act on certainty. She thought occasionally about what it meant to have used invisibility the way she had used it. She had been invisible to Holt throughout the period when she was building the record, and she had gone on being invisible to him in the period between the letter and the examination, and she had remained invisible to him in the weeks of the examination itself. The invisibility had protected her while she was building. After the outcome was decided, the invisibility had protected her in a different way. It had prevented him from knowing enough to confront her with the certainty he probably felt. He had run the geometry. She was confident he had arrived at the right answer. But the geometry was not a conversation. He had no conversation with which to address what the geometry told him. She found she did not spend much time thinking about this. It was settled. The situation had produced its outcome, and the outcome was as good as she had been able to achieve from where she stood, and the outcome was real. The three women had received their money, and Agnes Whitfield and Dorothy Marsh and Aldine Pratt each had a resource they had not expected, that partially addressed a harm they had not known was being done to them. Partial was not complete, but it was real. She wrote the date at the top of the fresh page. Below the date, she wrote nothing for a moment. Then she wrote the name of a new client who had come to her the previous week, with a question about her household accounts. A question Cora had been able to answer in 20 minutes, giving the woman both the answer and a method for arriving at similar answers herself going forward. The woman had thanked her in the specific way of someone who has been given not just a solution, but the ability to produce the solution themselves, which was the way Cora always preferred to be thanked. She wrote the name, and then she began.